A man who refused every woman in town until a seamstress no one noticed changed everything. In the frozen heart of the Montana Territory, a rancher who turned away every wealthy widow finally walked into town with a torn boot and a dying horse. What happened next in that mercantile would shatter everything the town thought they knew about Caleb Ward and the invisible Chinese girl working in the shadows. If you want to see how far this story travels, drop a comment with your city and hit that like button. Now let me take you back to the winter of 1885, when silence spoke louder than every proposal he ever refused. The wind came down from the Bitterroot Range like the breath of something ancient and unforgiving, carrying snow that cut visibility to mere feet and turned the world into a wall of white static. Iron Ridge huddled beneath that wind, a cluster of rough timber buildings pressed against the mountainside like refugees seeking shelter from a war they couldn't win. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin, desperate threads before being shredded by the gale. This was the kind of cold that killed quietly, the kind that found the weakness in a man's gear, his shelter, his resolve, and exploited it without mercy. Caleb Ward felt it through the torn seam of his left boot. The leather had split along the side 2 days ago, up near his camp at the timberline where he'd been checking trap lines. A small tear at first, the kind a man might ignore in warmer months. But winter in the high country didn't forgive small mistakes. Cold found that gap like water finds a crack, seeping in with every step until his foot had gone numb hours ago. He'd wrapped it with canvas torn from his bedroll, but that was a temporary measure at best, the kind of repair that bought time, nothing more. His horse, a sturdy buckskin mare named Della, picked her way down the snow-packed trail with the careful deliberation of an animal that understood the price of a misstep. Her breath came in heavy plumes. Ice crystals had formed in her whiskers and along the edge of her winter coat. Caleb kept one gloved hand on her neck, feeling the warmth of her through the leather, letting her set the pace. They'd been partners for 6 years. She knew these mountains as well as he did, knew when to push and when to hold back. The town emerged from the storm gradually, materializing like something conjured rather than built. First the stark outline of the church steeple, then the false-fronted buildings of Main Street, then the scattered houses spreading up the hillside like a rash. Caleb guided Della toward the livery stable at the end of town, dismounting stiffly in the relative shelter of the barn's entrance. His left foot had no feeling at all now. That was either very good or very bad, and he'd been in the mountains long enough to know which was more likely. Caleb Ward, the liveryman, a grizzled former cavalry sergeant named Tompkins, emerged from the shadows with a pitchfork in hand. Thought you'd have more sense than to come down in this. Boots torn. Caleb's voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by cold and disuse. He didn't talk much up at the ranch, and his voice often forgot how. Need it fixed before I lose the foot. Tompkins grunted, already moving to take Della's reins. Mercantile's still open. Barely. Most folks with any brains are home by their fires. Good. Caleb pulled his coat tighter. The heavy bearskin was one of the few things between him and death out here, and he treated it accordingly. Won't be long. He left Della in Tompkins' capable hands and stepped back into the wind. Main Street was nearly deserted, just a few hunched figures moving between buildings with the determined haste of people who understood exactly how hostile the world had become. Caleb kept his head down and his bad foot moving, even though he couldn't feel it. Stopping meant stiffening up, and stiffening up meant not moving again. The mercantile occupied a corner building with large windows that probably seemed welcoming in summer but now just looked cold. Great sheets of glass that let the warmth bleed out into the merciless air. Light spilled from inside, butter yellow and promising. Caleb shouldered through the door, and the sudden absence of wind felt like a benediction. Warmth hit him in stages, first just the absence of cold, then actual heat creeping into his face, his hands, the exposed skin around his collar. The mercantile was crowded with goods but empty of people. Shelves lined the walls, packed with everything from canned goods to fabric bolts to farm equipment. The smell was a mixture of coffee, leather, sawdust, and that peculiar mustiness that came from a building sealed tight against winter. We're closing. The voice came from behind the counter, sharp, nasal, and thoroughly unwelcoming. Caleb turned to face the speaker. Silas Garrett, the mercantile's owner, was a man who'd grown soft in all the wrong ways. Not the comfortable softness of prosperity, but the bloated, unhealthy softness of greed and indolence. His vest strained across his middle, and his face had the ruddy, broken-veined look of a man who sampled his own whiskey stock too generously. He was counting coins at the counter, fat fingers moving with surprising dexterity through stacks of silver. "Boot needs repair." Caleb lifted his left foot slightly, showing the tear. "Tonight." Garrett barely glanced up. "Come back Monday." "Can't help you now." "Won't make it to Monday with this." Caleb's voice stayed level, but something in it made Garrett finally look at him properly. Recognition flickered across the merchant's face, followed by calculation. Everyone in Iron Ridge knew Caleb Ward, or knew of him. The hermit rancher who lived up in the high country and came to town maybe 4 times a year. The man who'd inherited one of the largest spreads in the territory from his father and ran it alone, refusing every offer of help, every expression of neighborly concern, every widow's casserole and hopeful smile. The town had a mythology around Caleb Ward. They said he'd loved a woman once, back east, and she died. They said he'd killed a man in Denver and fled to the mountains. They said he preferred the company of animals to people, that he'd gone half wild up there in the timber. Some of it was probably true. Most of it was the kind of story people told to make sense of someone who didn't make sense to them. What was definitely true was that Caleb Ward had money. His father had been a shrewd businessman before the mountains killed him, and Caleb had inherited not just land, but capital. He ran his ranch with quiet competence, selling cattle and timber when prices were good, and he paid in gold coin when he came to town. Garrett's expression shifted into something that might have been meant as ingratiating but came across as oily. "Well now, Mr. Ward, I didn't realize it was urgent. Medical matter, is it?" "Could be." Caleb's eyes never left the merchant's face. "Depends how long I stand here talking." Right. Garrett set down his coins and rubbed his hands together. "Thing is, I don't do leather work myself. Never learned the skill. I could sell you a new pair of boots. Got some fine ones from Chicago. Just came in last month. Don't need new boots. Need these fixed." Caleb's patience, never abundant, was wearing thin. The warmth of the store was bringing feeling back to his foot, and with feeling came pain, a deep bone ache that suggested frostbite had started its work. Garrett spread his hands in a gesture of helpless sympathy that fooled neither of them. "Like I said, I don't have the skill for it. Maybe over at the cobbler's, but he closed up hours ago, and I can't say when he'll— I can fix it." The voice was so quiet that for a moment Caleb thought he'd imagined it. It came from the back corner of the store, from a space he'd barely registered, a small workbench set up near the stove, half hidden behind bolts of fabric. Caleb turned. A woman sat there, so still she might have been part of the furniture. Chinese, maybe 25, with straight black hair pulled back from a face that managed to be both delicate and strong. Her hands rested on the workbench, and even from across the room Caleb could see the evidence of her trade: a needle case, spools of thread, scraps of leather and fabric. She wore a plain gray dress that had been mended so many times it was more repair than original cloth, and she met his gaze with an expression that was utterly neutral, not friendly, not hostile, just present. "You." Garrett's voice took on an edge. "You don't speak unless spoken to. Get back to work." The woman, Leanne, Caleb would learn later, though no one in the store would use her name, didn't flinch. She simply looked at Garrett with that same neutral expression, then back at Caleb. "I can fix it," she repeated. Her English carried an accent but was perfectly clear. "I have the tools and the leather. 1 hour, maybe less." Garrett's face darkened. "She's not authorized to do business on her own. Any work she does is my work, and like I said, we're closed. Besides, that's heavy leather repair, man's boots, trail gear. She does needlework, alterations, women's things." Caleb looked at the workbench again, more carefully this time. Mixed in with the feminine items, lace, delicate fabrics, the kind of finery that women in a frontier town aspired to, were other things. A saddlebag, partially repaired, with stitching so fine it was almost invisible. A leather coat with a replaced panel that matched the original so perfectly you'd never know it had been damaged. A horse bridle with intricate decorative work that would have commanded a premium price in Denver. The woman followed his gaze and understood. She stood, barely 5 feet tall, moving with an economy of motion that suggested both grace and efficiency, and crossed to where Caleb stood. Without asking permission, she knelt and examined his boot. Her fingers touched the torn leather with surprising firmness, testing the damage, the remaining integrity of the material, the type of sole construction. The examination took perhaps 10 seconds. "Sat through," she said, looking up at him. "The leather is cold damaged. Simple stitch will not hold. Needs a patch, internal and external, with weatherproof treatment. I have everything needed." The directness of it caught Caleb off guard. He was used to people in Iron Ridge either fawning over him or avoiding him entirely, depending on whether they wanted something or feared his reputation for harsh words. This woman did neither. She'd assessed a problem, determined a solution, and stated facts. It was the kind of communication he understood. "How much?" he asked. "She's not doing it." Garrett came around the counter, his bulk moving with surprising speed. "I told you, we're closed, and even if we weren't, I don't hire out my workers for private deals." "She's not your worker," Caleb said quietly. "She's a person doing skilled labor. I'm asking what she charges." "I own this store." Garrett's voice climbed toward a shout. "Everything in it, everyone in it, all business conducted here. It's mine. You want to deal with her, you deal with me. And I'm telling you, $2, Leon said. Still kneeling, still examining the boot, her voice calm as a mountain lake. "For materials and labor, payment direct." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Garrett's face went from red to purple. "You don't set prices. You don't negotiate. You don't even speak to customers without my—" "I'll pay $3, Caleb interrupted. He pulled off his coat and started unlacing the damaged boot. "For the work and for the inconvenience of staying late. You fix it right, and I'll pay in gold." Leanne nodded once and returned to her workbench. "This is my establishment." Garrett's hands had curled into fists. "I won't have my authority undermined by some Chinese girl who—" "Then close your establishment." Caleb's voice didn't rise, but it cut through Garrett's bluster like a knife through cloth. "Lock the door. Go home. Just do it after she fixes my boot, because that's happening whether you like it or not." For a long moment, Garrett stood there, visibly calculating. Caleb Ward represented money, significant money, the kind that could make a quarterly ledger look very good. But Caleb Ward also represented a challenge to authority, and Garrett was the kind of small man who needed authority the way other men needed air. Pride warred with greed. Greed won, as it usually did. "Fine," Garrett spat, "but the payment comes to me. All of it. And you." He jabbed a finger toward Leanne. "You better do this perfect, or you'll be sorry." He stomped back to his counter, making a great show of returning to his coin counting, though his attention was clearly focused on the drama unfolding in his store. Caleb sat down on a stool near Leon's workbench and pulled off the damaged boot with a grunt. His foot was blotchy, red in some places, white in others, swollen around the ankle. Not good, but probably not permanently damaged if he got it warm and dry soon. Leon brought a basin of warm water without being asked. "Soak," she instructed. "Slow warming is better than fast." While his foot soaked, Caleb watched her work. She examined the boot with the intense focus of a surgeon examining a patient, turning it in the lamplight, running her fingers along seams and stress points. Then she selected tools from her kit with absolute certainty. An awl, several needles of different sizes, thread that looked heavier than anything Garrett probably stocked in the store, and 2 pieces of leather cut from what appeared to be her personal supply. "This isn't store material," Caleb observed. "No." She was already marking cut lines on the leather with a piece of chalk. "Mr. Garrett's leather is poor quality, thin. For this repair, you need strength." "Won't he be angry you used your own material?" For the first time, something like expression crossed her face, a flicker of bitter amusement. "Mr. Garrett will take his payment and be quiet about what materials were used." She worked in silence after that, and Caleb let her. He'd always been comfortable with silence. The mountains were silent more often than not, and he'd learned to hear what silence said. This silence spoke of concentration, of skill applied with patience, of someone who'd learned their craft through repetition and necessity rather than formal training. Her hands moved with absolute precision. She cut the leather patches with a straight edge that left edges clean as machine work. She punched holes with spacing so regular they might have been measured with calipers. When she began stitching, using a technique Caleb had never seen before, something that involved 2 needles working simultaneously from opposite sides, Each pull of thread created a lock stitch that would hold against anything short of complete material failure. The internal patch went in first, reinforcing the torn area from inside the boot. Then the external patch, fitted so perfectly that the overlap was almost invisible. She treated both with something from a small bottle, an oil or wax that soaked into the leather and gave it a slight sheen. Waterproofing, she explained, catching his curious look. The cold breaks down the natural oils. This restores them. Your boot will be more flexible now, more resistant to further damage. Where'd you learn this? She didn't answer immediately, focused on the final stitches. When she did speak, her voice was carefully neutral. My father was a leather worker in Guangdong before we came to California. He taught me when I was very young, said skills were the only inheritance that couldn't be stolen. Smart man. Yes. The single syllable carried weight, memory, loss, things she wouldn't share with a stranger. He was. She finished the stitching and held up the boot to the lamplight, examining her work with a critical eye. Apparently satisfied, she passed it to Caleb. Try it. Walk around. It should feel comfortable. Caleb dried his foot and pulled on the boot. The fit was perfect. Snug but not tight, the repaired area flexible but reinforced. He stood and took a few steps, testing. The repair held without any sense of weakness or stress. It was better than good. It was masterwork. How long have you been working for Garrett? He asked. Leanne began cleaning her tools, arranging them back in her kit with the same precision she'd applied to the repair. 3 years. He pay you fair? Her hands paused for just a fraction of a second. I have room and board, work, and a place to sleep. In this territory, for someone like me, that is more than many have. It wasn't an answer to his question, and they both knew it. Caleb pulled a small leather pouch from his coat pocket and counted out 3 gold eagles, $30, 10 times what she'd asked. He set them on her workbench, deliberately bypassing Garrett at the counter. For the work, he said, and the materials you used from your own stock. Leanne stared at the coins. In the lamplight, they glowed like small suns. Her face had gone very still. That is too much. That's the price of quality in a country where quality is rare. Caleb pulled on his coat. You earned it. I can't. She lowered her voice, glancing toward where Garrett stood watching, his face darkening with suspicion. If I take that, he'll what? Caleb kept his voice equally low. It's payment for labor. Your labor. He wanted to dispute that. He can take it up with me. You don't understand. There was urgency in her voice now, real fear breaking through that carefully maintained neutrality. I have a contract. Everything I earn, he claims as compensation for my room and my board. If you give me that and he sees, he'll say I'm stealing from him. He'll have the sheriff, Hey! Garrett's shout cut through their conversation. What are you two whispering about over there? Girl, bring that payment here. Now. Leanne's hand moved toward the coins, but Caleb's hand was faster. He swept the gold eagles back into his pouch in one smooth motion. Garrett! He called out, his voice carrying across the store. I'm going to pay you exactly what she quoted. $2 for materials and labor. The rest is between me and her. The hell it is! Garrett came around the counter again, his face floored with rage. That girl is bound to me by legal contract. Any work she does, any payment she receives, it all comes through me. That's the law. The law says you can claim reasonable compensation for room and board, Caleb said. He dealt with enough contracts in his cattle business to know the basics. It doesn't say you own a person's labor outright. That would be slavery, and slavery's been illegal for 20 years. She's Chinese, Garrett's voice dripped contempt. The Exclusion Act says they can't immigrate. Doesn't say the ones already here aren't entitled to wages for work performed. Caleb pulled out 2 silver dollars and set them on the counter with deliberate precision. There's your payment. The rest is my business. It's theft. Then call the sheriff. Caleb's eyes locked with Garrett's. Let's have him come down here and examine this contract of yours. See if it's legal. See if keeping someone in indentured servitude for room and board that probably costs you $5 a month is within the bounds of the law. While we're at it, we can discuss those bolts of Chinese silk you've got in back. The ones you couldn't legally import after 1882 but somehow acquired anyway. Garrett's face went from red to white. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. I thought we might not need the sheriff after all, Caleb said softly. He turned back to Leon. She stood frozen, her eyes wide with something that might have been hope or terror or both. Around them, the store had gone silent except for the pop and hiss of the fire in the stove. Caleb made a decision that surprised him even as he made it. You have family here? He asked her. No. Her voice was barely a whisper. Friends? Anyone you'd need to tell if you were leaving town? She shook her head. You got belongings? Anything you can't leave behind? A bag, upstairs in my room. Clothes, some tools, a few personal things. Understanding was beginning to dawn in her eyes. Why are you... Get it, Caleb said. Right now. Whatever you can carry in 5 minutes. You can't. Garrett found his voice again. She's contracted to me. You can't just... Can't what? She's not property. This isn't a slave state. Caleb kept his eyes on Leon. You want to stay here, work off whatever debt he claims you owe him, that's your choice. But if you want to leave, nothing's stopping you. Not him, not a piece of paper, and certainly not the law. She'll starve. Garrett's voice took on a wheedling tone. She's got no money, no prospects. Chinese girl in this territory, alone? She'll be dead in a week. She won't be alone, Caleb heard himself say. She'll work for me. I've got a ranch that needs maintenance, buildings that need repair. Someone with her skills could make herself useful. Room, board, and actual wages. Legal contract if she wants one, or a handshake if she doesn't. Leon stared at him. You don't know me. I know you're the only person in this town who fixed my boot right instead of trying to sell me a new one. I know you're skilled at work I need done. That's enough. This is kidnapping, Garrett was shouting now, his voice shrill with panic and rage. This is theft. I'll have the law on you, Ward. I'll have you arrested for For what? Caleb's voice cut through the bluster like a blade. Offering someone a job? Last I checked, that was legal. You want to press charges? Go ahead. Bring your contract, bring your lawyer, bring your sheriff. We'll sort it out in front of a judge. The threat hung in the air. They both knew Garrett wouldn't bring it to a judge. His contract was likely illegal or, at best, highly questionable, and any serious scrutiny would expose business practices he desperately wanted to keep hidden. Leon took a step toward the stairs, then stopped. My things. Go, Caleb said gently. Get them. I'll be here. She went, moving quickly up the narrow stairs at the back of the store. Caleb heard footsteps overhead, the sound of rapid movement, a drawer opening and closing. Garrett stood behind his counter, his hands gripping the edge hard enough to make his knuckles white. You're making a mistake, Ward. That girl, she's trouble. Ungrateful, disobedient. You'll regret this. Maybe, Caleb said, but it'll be my regret, not yours. She owes me. 3 years of room and board, food, shelter. 3 years of labor from someone with skills like hers should have paid off any reasonable debt 10 times over. Caleb picked up his repaired boot and examined it one more time. The stitching was flawless. You've been stealing from her, Garrett. We both know it. The only question is whether you're going to keep digging this hole or shut up and take your $2. Footsteps on the stairs. Leon descended carrying a cloth bag that looked like it might have once held grain. It wasn't large. Everything she owned in the world, apparently, fit into a space about the size of a saddlebag. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, looking between Caleb and Garrett with an expression of profound uncertainty. For a moment, the choice hung there, the known misery versus the unknown possibility. The storm's getting worse, Caleb said quietly. If we're going to make it to my place before dark, we need to leave now. Leon looked at Garrett one last time. Whatever she saw in his face, rage, greed, impotent fury, it decided her. She turned to Caleb and nodded. Then let's go, Caleb said. He opened the door and the wind rushed in, bringing snow and cold and the smell of pine and ice. Leon pulled her thin coat tighter, inadequate for the weather, like everything else she had, and stepped out into the storm. Caleb followed, letting the door slam shut behind him. The wind hit them like a physical force, driving snow into their faces and stealing their breath. Caleb grabbed Leon's arm to keep her from being blown off her feet and guided her down the street toward the livery. She was so light that the wind threatened to simply pick her up and carry her away. He kept his grip firm but not rough, leading her through snow that was already ankle-deep and getting deeper by the minute. At the livery, Tompkins looked up from where he'd been brushing down Della, his eyebrows climbing toward his hairline when he saw Caleb had acquired a companion. "Need another horse," Caleb said. "Something steady. I'll pay double your usual rate." Tompkins looked at Lion, then back at Caleb, clearly bursting with questions but wise enough not to ask them. "Got a bay mare. Nice temperament. You bringing her back?" "Eventually. Double rate plus deposit on the horse." "Fair." Caleb counted out coins while Tompkins saddled the bay. The old soldier worked efficiently, checking every strap and buckle twice. When he handed over the reins, he leaned close to Caleb. "That's Garrett's girl," he said quietly. "Not anymore." "He's gonna raise hell." "Let him." Caleb took the reins. "He tries anything. You send word to the ranch. I'll handle it." Tompkins nodded slowly. "Your business, I suppose. But Ward, be careful. Garrett's got connections. Town council, some of the other merchants. You just made yourself an enemy." "Won't be the first time." Caleb helped Leon onto the bay mare. She settled into the saddle with the easy confidence of someone who'd ridden before, despite the fact that her feet barely reached the stirrups. "Won't be the last." They rode out of Iron Ridge into the teeth of the storm, leaving behind a warm store and a furious merchant, and a town that would be talking about this for months. The journey to Caleb's ranch normally took an hour in good weather. In the storm, with visibility down to almost nothing and the trail disappearing under fresh snow, it took nearly 3. Caleb led the way on Della, trusting the mare's instincts more than his own eyes, keeping Leanne close behind him. Several times he stopped to check that she was still there, still upright in the saddle, not frozen or lost or thrown. Each time she was there, small and silent and enduring, wrapped in her inadequate coat but sitting straight in the saddle, trusting him to know the way. The ranch house appeared suddenly, materializing from the white void like a ship emerging from fog. It was a massive structure built by Caleb's father in the years when timber was cheap and ambition was high. 2 stories of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney at each end and windows that glowed with lamplight that Caleb had left burning when he departed 3 days ago. They put the horses in the barn first, basic care before personal comfort, the ironclad rule of anyone who depended on animals for survival. The barn was well built and weathertight, warm from the body heat of the other horses and the 2 milk cows Caleb kept. They unsaddled, rubbed down both horses, gave them grain and hay and fresh water. Only when the animals were settled did Caleb lead Leon across the yard to the house. The interior hit like a wall of warmth. Caleb had banked the fires before leaving, but enough coals remained in both fireplaces that the house had stayed above freezing. He immediately set about building up the fires again, adding kindling and then larger wood until flames were crackling in both the main room and the kitchen. Leon stood just inside the door, still clutching her bag, looking around with wide eyes. The house was large. Too large for one person, really, designed for a family that had never fully materialized. The main room had a stone fireplace big enough to roast a whole pig, heavy furniture built to last generations, and windows that looked out toward the mountains. The kitchen was well equipped, with a modern cast-iron stove and a hand pump that brought water directly inside. A hallway led to 4 bedrooms upstairs and 2 more down. It was also, Leon could immediately see, in a state of bachelor neglect. Dust covered every surface. Dishes were piled in the sink. The floor hadn't been swept in what looked like months. The furniture, though well made, had the desolate look of things that were used but not cared for. "It's not much," Caleb said, misreading her silence. "But it's warm, and it's solid, and it's yours if you want it." Leon turned to look at him, and for the first time since the mercantile, her neutral mask cracked. "Why did you do that?" "Do what?" "Take me from there. Offer me work. You don't know anything about me. I could be—" She searched for words. "A thief. A liar. Trouble, like Mr. Garrett said." Caleb shrugged out of his bearskin coat and hung it on a peg by the door. "Could be. But I watched you work. I saw how you treated that repair. Like it mattered. Like quality mattered more than speed or profit. That tells me more about a person than any reference letter." "But you barely spoke to me. You don't know. I know Garrett had you working skilled labor and paying you nothing. I know that kind of arrangement doesn't sit right with me, never has. And I know that if you can repair leather that well, you can probably handle a dozen other tasks around this ranch that I've been putting off, Because I don't have the skill or the patience. He moved toward the kitchen. Plus, I'm tired of my own cooking. If you can cook even half as well as you sew, it'll be an improvement. The practicality of it seemed to steady her. What are the terms? Terms? Of employment. You said room, board, and wages. What wages? What duties? What are the boundaries? It was a fair question, and the directness of it reminded Caleb why he'd liked her in the first place. $50 a month to start. More if the work proves worth it. Duties are maintenance, cooking, cleaning, mending, any skilled repair work that comes up. There's always something broken on a ranch this size. The boundaries are that you live here, I live here, and we stay out of each other's way, except when work requires otherwise. And if I want to leave? You leave. No contract, no debt, no obligation. You want to go tomorrow, I'll ride you back to town and help you find other work. Leon studied him for a long moment. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her because she finally set down her bag and began unbuttoning her snow-soaked coat. I can cook, she said quietly. My mother taught me before she died. I can clean and mend, and I know basic carpentry and metalwork from helping my father. I can read and write English and Chinese. I can keep accounts if needed. I work hard and I don't make trouble. Sounds like I got a bargain then. For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched the corner of her mouth. We'll see if you still think so when you taste my cooking. She hung her coat next to his, rolled up her sleeves, and surveyed the kitchen with the expression of a general surveying a battlefield. First we eat. Then we can discuss the rest. Caleb found himself nodding, suddenly aware that he was exhausted and starving, and that his foot, despite the excellent repair to his boot, was throbbing with the painful intensity of tissue coming back to life after frostbite. He sat down at the kitchen table, a massive thing made from a single plank of Douglas fir, and let her work. She moved through his kitchen with the same focused efficiency she'd brought to the boot repair, locating supplies, assessing what was available, making decisions. Within minutes, she had the stove stoked hot and something sizzling in a pan. The smell alone was enough to make Caleb's stomach wake up and remember it existed. 20 minutes later, she set a plate in front of him. Simple food, eggs, salt pork, the last of some potatoes he'd stored in the cellar, all cooked with a precision that elevated basic ingredients into something approaching comfort. He ate in silence, and so did she, both of them too hungry and too tired for conversation. When they'd finished, Leon cleared the plates and pumped water for washing. Caleb watched her work, this small woman who'd upended his solitary existence in the space of a few hours. Outside, the storm hammered against the windows, but inside, the fire burned warm and the house felt less empty than it had in years. You can have the room at the end of the hall upstairs, he said. It's got a good stove connection so it stays warm, clean bedding in the chest at the foot of the bed. Leon nodded, drying her hands on a towel. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You haven't spent a winter in the mountains. It's not easy. I've endured difficult things before. She picked up her bag. I'll manage. She climbed the stairs, her footsteps soft on the wood. Caleb heard her moving around in the room above, settling in. He added another log to the fire and sat in the old armchair his father had favored, letting the heat and the exhaustion pull him toward sleep. Outside, the wind screamed down from the bitterroots, rattling the windows and piling snow against the walls. But inside Caleb Ward's house, for the first time in 3 years of solitary living, there was the sound of another person, footsteps overhead, the creak of a bed frame, the small sounds of human habitation. He told himself it was just practical. He needed help around the ranch, and she needed work. That was all. But as he drifted toward sleep, his last conscious thought was of precise fingers stitching leather, of neutral brown eyes that saw more than they revealed, of quiet competence in the face of casual cruelty. The storm blew itself out sometime after midnight, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. And in the morning, everything would be different. Morning came sharp and bright, the kind of crystalline winter dawn that turned the world into cut glass and silver light. Caleb woke to silence, not the oppressive silence of solitude he'd grown accustomed to, but something different. A silence that held presence within it, the awareness that the house around him was inhabited by more than just himself and the mice in the walls. He dressed quickly, pulling on wool socks and heavy trousers, a flannel shirt worn soft from years of use. The air in his room held a bite despite the fires he'd banked the night before. Through the window, he could see snow piled high against the fence posts, pristine and unmarked except for the delicate tracks of rabbits and the heavier prints of deer that had passed through in the night. Downstairs, he found the kitchen already warm, the stove radiating heat, and Leon moving between the counter and the table with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been awake for some time. The smell of coffee filled the air, real coffee, not the bitter burnt offering he usually produced, and something else. Bread, maybe. Something baking. She looked up when he entered, her hair pulled back in a simple braid, wearing the same gray dress from yesterday, but with an apron tied over it. "Good morning." "Morning." Caleb moved toward the coffee pot, then hesitated. "You didn't have to. I was awake." She poured coffee into a tin cup and set it on the table. "I'm not accustomed to sleeping late." He sat and wrapped his hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into his fingers. The coffee was perfect, strong and dark, but not harsh. "What time did you get up?" "Before dawn. I wanted to understand the house, the kitchen, what supplies you have." She gestured toward the pantry. "You have staples, but not much variety. Flour, salt, dried beans, some preserved vegetables. The root cellar has potatoes and onions, a few turnips. There's venison hanging in the barn, properly smoked. But no fresh vegetables, no eggs except what you buy in town, no milk unless you count what the cows give." "The cows are for emergencies," Caleb said. "I sell most of the milk to Tompkins when I'm in town." "You could keep chickens. A small flock would give you eggs year-round, and they handle cold well if the coop is properly built." He took a long drink of coffee, studying her over the rim of the cup. "You know about raising chickens?" "I know about survival." She pulled something from the oven, biscuits golden and steaming. "In California, after my father died, I worked at a mission farm for 2 years before Mr. Garrett brought me here. They taught me about chickens, pigs, dairy cows, how to make a small piece of land produce enough to feed many people." "Why'd you leave California?" Her hands paused in their work for just a moment. "Mr. Garrett came to the mission looking for workers. He said he had a mercantile in Montana Territory, that he needed someone skilled with a needle to do alterations and fine work. He said he'd pay fair wages, provide room and board, that it would be a good position." She set the biscuits on the table with more force than necessary. "I was young and stupid enough to believe him." "You weren't stupid. You were hopeful. There's a difference." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if trying to decide whether he meant it or was simply being kind. Whatever she decided, she gave a small nod and turned back to the stove. They ate in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable, but wasn't hostile either. The silence of two people who didn't yet know how to talk to each other, but were willing to try. The biscuits were excellent, light and flaky, despite the limitations of Caleb's pantry. He ate 4 of them with butter and wild strawberry preserves he'd bought in town last summer. When they'd finished, Leon cleared the plates and began washing them in the basin. Caleb stood, stretching muscles that were sore from yesterday's ride. "I need to check the livestock, make sure the barn held up through the storm. You want to come see the setup?" She dried her hands and followed him out into the shocking cold of the morning. The world had been transformed overnight. Snow lay 3 feet deep in the places where the wind had piled it, and even in the swept areas it came up past their ankles. The sky overhead was so blue it hurt to look at, and the sun on the snow was bright enough to make Caleb squint. Lion gasped when she saw the view. From the house, looking west, the Bitterroot Range rose in jagged peaks that seemed to scrape the sky. Sunlight caught on snow-covered ridges and turned them into fire. Below the peaks, dark forests of pine and fir rolled down toward the valley, where Caleb's ranch sat cradled between the high country and the lower grasslands. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "It's deadly," Caleb replied, but there wasn't any harshness in his voice. "Beautiful things usually are out here." They made their way to the barn, breaking trail through snow that hadn't been touched since the storm ended. Inside, the livestock were restless but healthy. 2 horses besides Dela and the borrowed bay, both sturdy ranch horses bred for mountain work. The 2 milk cows, placid and unbothered by the weather. And in the back stall, something Caleb hadn't mentioned, a small flock of sheep, maybe 20 head, their wool thick and oily from winter growth. "I thought you said you didn't have chickens," Leon said. I don't. These are sheep, different animal. I know what sheep are. There was amusement in her voice, the first hint of it he'd heard. I'm saying if you can manage sheep, you can manage chickens. Chickens are easier. Sheep take care of themselves mostly. Just need shearing in spring and watching for predators. Chickens take care of themselves entirely if you do it right, and they give you eggs daily instead of wool once a year. She moved closer to the sheep pen, studying the animals with a practiced eye. These are good stock. Why hide them in the back of the barn? Caleb shrugged. They're not hidden, just not important enough to mention. Everything on a ranch is important. She reached over the stall door and ran her hand along one ew's back, testing the wool. This one's pregnant. And that one. You have lambs coming in late winter? February, usually. You'll need to watch them close when they come. Make sure the barn stays warm enough that the mothers don't reject the weak ones. I've been doing this for 6 years, Caleb said, but there wasn't any defensiveness in it, just statement of fact. Yes. And you've been doing it alone, which means some things get neglected even when you don't mean to neglect them. She turned to face him. That's not criticism, that's just reality. One person can only do so much. They finished checking the animals and returned to the house. The day stretched ahead of them, full of the small tasks that made up ranch life in winter, splitting wood, checking feed supplies, melting snow for water to supplement what the pump provided, a dozen other chores that Caleb usually handled in solitary silence. But today, Leanne worked beside him. She insisted on helping split wood despite her size, and while she couldn't match his strength, she made up for it with technique, finding the natural grain of the wood, placing her strikes with precision rather than force. They built up the woodpile near the house, stacking split logs where they'd stay dry and accessible even in the worst weather. When they came inside for the midday meal, Leanne had transformed the kitchen. It was clean, truly clean, not just functionally tidy. The dishes were washed and put away. The counters had been scrubbed. The floor had been swept and mopped. Even the windows had been wiped down so that light streamed through them unobstructed. You didn't have to do all this, Caleb said. Yes, I did. She was already preparing food, working with what little was available to create something more than the sum of its parts. If I'm going to work here, I need to be able to work properly. That means a clean kitchen, organized supplies, knowing where everything is. He couldn't argue with that logic, so he didn't try. Over the next few days, a rhythm developed between them. Caleb would wake early and tend to the morning livestock chores while Leanne prepared breakfast. They'd eat together in the kitchen, conversation sparse but not uncomfortable. Then they'd tackle the day's work, sometimes together, sometimes separately, depending on what needed doing. Leanne threw herself into improving the house with focused intensity. She cleaned years of bachelor neglect from every room, organized supplies that had been scattered randomly, mended curtains and linens that Caleb hadn't even realized were torn. She found the sewing machine in one of the spare rooms, a treadle model that had belonged to Caleb's mother, and spent an evening oiling and adjusting it until it ran smoothly. I didn't know that still worked, Caleb said, watching her test the machine with scraps of fabric. It works fine, just needed care. Her feet worked the treadle with practiced rhythm, feeding fabric under the presser foot in a straight, even line. This is good equipment. Your mother must have been skilled. I don't remember much about her. She died when I was 8. Leanne's hand stilled on the fabric. I'm sorry. Long time ago. Caleb moved toward the door. I'm going to check the trap lines tomorrow, up near the ridge. I'll be gone most of the day. Be careful. He nodded and left her to her work. The trap lines yielded 3 rabbits and a fox, good pelts that would bring decent money in town when he could get there. Caleb skinned and stretched them in the barn, working by lamplight as evening came on. When he returned to the house, the smell of cooking greeted him, something rich and savory that made his mouth water. What's that? He asked, stamping snow from his boots. Stew, venison, potatoes, onions, the last of the dried beans. It needs to simmer another hour. She was kneading dough at the kitchen counter, her small hands working it with steady pressure. How were the trap lines? Good. 3 rabbits, 1 fox. You'll need to check them every few days or the meat will spoil even in the cold. I know how to run a trap line. I'm sure you do. Her voice was mild, but there was something underneath it, a gentle challenge, perhaps. I'm also sure you've had days when the weather kept you inside and the traps went unchecked and you lost the catch. He had, of course. More than once. Point taken. She shaped the dough into loaves and set them to rise near the stove. I could check the lower trap lines when you're working the upper ones, if you showed me how. Caleb considered this. It went against his grain to delegate work that he'd always done himself, but it also made practical sense. The lower trap lines were closer to the house, easier to reach, and having them checked regularly would increase the yield. I'll teach you tomorrow, he said. A week passed, then another. The weather held cold but clear, perfect for the work of winter. Caleb fell into the routine of having another person in the house, with surprising ease. He thought he wanted solitude, had built his life around it, but there was a difference, he was discovering, between solitude and loneliness. One was a choice. The other was just emptiness. Leanne brought life to the house in ways he hadn't anticipated. She hummed while she worked, wordless melodies that sounded like lullabies from another world. She arranged the furniture slightly, making the rooms feel more welcoming without changing their fundamental character. She found his father's old books in a trunk and set them on shelves where they could be accessed and enjoyed rather than forgotten. And she talked, though not constantly. Small observations about the work, questions about the ranch, stories from her own past that she offered carefully, testing whether he wanted to hear them. Caleb found himself responding more than he'd talked in years, sharing details about the land, the animals, the rhythm of seasons in the high country. One evening, sitting by the fire after dinner, Leanne looked up from the mending in her lap. "Why do you live up here alone?" The question caught him off guard. "It's my ranch. Where else would I live?" "You could hire help, have people working for you, living in the bunkhouse. Most ranchers do. Most ranchers are different than me." "That's not an answer." Caleb stared into the fire, watching flames curl around a log. "I had people here once. When my father was alive, we had a full crew. Hands to work the cattle, a cook, a foreman. This place was busy." "What happened?" "My father died. Kicked by a horse, died 3 days later from the injury. The crew stayed on for a while, but I was young, barely 20, and I didn't know how to manage men. Some of them took advantage, stole equipment, let the cattle wander, figured I wouldn't notice. When I did notice and called them on it, most of them left." He paused. "The ones who stayed, I ended up letting go anyway. I couldn't tell who I could trust, and I couldn't run a place where I was constantly watching my own workers for signs of theft or laziness, so I decided to do it myself. That must have been difficult. It was easier than dealing with people I couldn't trust." Leanne set down her mending. "Is that why you didn't marry? The town talks about it. How you refused every woman who expressed interest." "The town talks about everything." Caleb's voice was dry. "Gives them something to do in winter when there's no other entertainment." "But it's true?" He shrugged. "I'm not interested in marrying someone who wants to marry my land or my money. And most of the women who've expressed interest, that's what they wanted. They saw a ranch and a bank account, not a person." "All of them?" "Enough of them." He stood and added another log to the fire. "What about you? You never married?" "No one ever asked, and even if they had, I couldn't, mister. Garrett's contract forbade it. Said I couldn't marry or leave town without his permission." She picked up her mending again, her stitches precise and even. "He was afraid I'd marry and stop working for him, so he made sure I couldn't." "That contract was illegal." "Legal, illegal. It doesn't matter when you have no money for a lawyer and no one willing to stand up for you." She bit off a thread. "Except you did." "Whitebow." "Told you. I don't like seeing skilled workers exploited." "That's still not the whole answer." Caleb turned to face her. "What do you want me to say? That I saw you being treated like property, and it made me angry?" "Fine. It made me angry. This country fought a war over whether people could be owned, and we decided they couldn't. But 20 years later, there are still plenty of men like Garrett who figure they can get around that if they're clever about the paperwork. It's wrong, and I don't abide wrong when I can do something about it." "Wait." Leanne studied him in the firelight. "You're a strange man, Caleb Ward." "I've been told." "Strange, but not bad." She returned to her mending. "I'm glad you came to town that day." "So am I." The admission surprised them both. Caleb cleared his throat and moved toward the stairs. "I'm turning in. Morning comes early." "It always does." He climbed to his room and lay in the darkness, listening to the small sounds of Leanne finishing her work below, banking the fires, climbing the stairs to her own room. The house settled around them, timber creaking in the cold, wind muttering against the eaves. Caleb stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time he'd felt this settled, this comfortable in his own home. It had been years. Maybe since before his father died, back when the house was full and loud, and he took for granted that someone would always be there when he came in from the cold. He'd thought he was content alone. Now he was beginning to suspect he'd just been enduring. The next morning brought clouds rolling in from the west, heavy and gray with the promise of more snow. Caleb spent the morning reinforcing the barn roof where he'd noticed a weak spot, working with hammer and nails while the wind picked up and the temperature dropped. By midday, the first flakes were falling, not the howling storm of the week before, but steady and determined. Leanne met him at the door with hot coffee and dry clothes. "You're soaked through." "Comes with the work." But he accepted both the coffee and the clothes gratefully, changing in front of the fire while she discreetly busied herself in the kitchen. The snow continued through the afternoon and into the evening, accumulating steadily. After dinner, they sat in the main room, Caleb repairing a bridle that had cracked in the cold, while Leanne worked on altering one of his old shirts to fit her smaller frame. "Tell me about China," Caleb said abruptly. Leanne's hands paused. "I don't remember much. I was very young when we left, maybe 6 years old." "What do you remember?" "Colors. Bright colors everywhere, red and gold and jade green. The sound of the city, which was loud in a way that's different from American cities. Crowded, but everyone seemed to know their place in it, their role." She resumed her stitching. "I remember my grandmother, just barely. She had very long hair that she wore in a braid, and she would let me help brush it in the evenings. She smelled like jasmine and something else I can't name." "Why'd your family leave?" "Opportunity," my father said. "There was word that California needed workers, that a Chinese man with skills could build a good life there. We saved for 2 years to pay for passage." Her voice went quiet. "My mother died on the ship. Cholera. My grandmother, too. By the time we reached San Francisco, it was just my father and me. I'm sorry." "It was long ago." She echoed his own words back to him. "My father did his best. He found work in a leather shop, saved money, tried to build the life he'd promised my mother. But California wasn't as welcoming as he'd hoped. The laws kept changing, making it harder for Chinese people to work, to own property, to bring over families. He never remarried, just worked and saved and taught me everything he knew, like maybe if I was skilled enough, I could survive better than he had." "Did he see you become a seamstress?" "He taught me to be one, but he died before I could really use the skills. Accident at the tannery where he worked. A vat of chemicals spilled, the fumes overcame him." She set down the shirt and stared into the fire. "The mission took me in after that. They were kind, in their way. Fed me, gave me a place to sleep, taught me English and arithmetic and how to read the Bible. In exchange, I worked their farm and their workshop. It wasn't a bad life. But when Mr. Garrett came offering wages and independence, it seemed like a chance to be something more than charity. Instead, you got a different kind of trap." "Yes." She picked up the shirt again. "But that trap is broken now, thanks to you." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling and the wind blowing snow against the windows. Outside, the world was disappearing again into whiteness, but inside, the house held steady against the storm. "I've been thinking," Leanne said eventually, "about the chickens." Caleb looked up from the bridle. "Still on about that?" "You need eggs. Fresh eggs, not the ones you buy in town that are already a week old by the time you get them home. And chickens would give you meat too if you managed the flock right." She met his eyes. "I could build the coop if you'd let me. I know how. Learned at the mission. And I could manage the birds. It wouldn't take away from other work." It's December, middle of winter. Not exactly ideal construction weather. The weather will break. It always does, even in winter. And I could do the planning now, gather materials from what you already have. When we get a clear spell, I could build it." Caleb considered. The idea had merit, even if it went against his preference for keeping things as they were. "You'd need lumber for the coop, wire for the run, straw for bedding. And we'd need to get the chickens themselves from town, which means a trip in cold weather. We could get chicks in early spring instead. Start small. Let them grow through summer and fall. By next winter, you'd have eggs and meat both. You're planning to still be here in spring? The question hung between them. Leanne's hand stilled on the fabric, and she looked at him directly. Am I not welcome to stay? That's not what I said. Then what are you asking? Caleb set down the bridle. I'm asking if you're planning to stay, or if this is temporary for you. Because if you're planning to stay, then yes, build the chicken coop. Plan for spring. Make this place work better than I've been making it work alone. But if you're just passing through until you find something else, then I'd rather not get used to having you here. Leanne was quiet for a long moment. I don't know what I'm planning. A month ago, I didn't plan to leave Iron Ridge. A week ago, I didn't plan to be living on a mountain ranch. My plans haven't worked out well, so maybe I should stop making them and just see what happens. That's not much of an answer. It's the only honest one I have. She folded the altered shirt carefully. But I can tell you this, I like it here. The work is hard, but it's honest work, and I can see the results of it. You pay me fairly and treat me with respect. The house is starting to feel like it could be a home instead of just shelter. So unless you're planning to send me away, I'll stay as long as you'll have me. I'm not planning to send you away. Then I'm not planning to leave. She stood, the shirt draped over her arm. I'll draw up plans for the chicken coop tomorrow. We can discuss materials and placement when you have time. She climbed the stairs to her room, leaving Caleb alone with the fire and his thoughts. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, long and lonely, the sound of something calling into emptiness without expecting an answer. Caleb understood that sound. He'd been making it himself for years without realizing it, but maybe, he thought as he banked the fire and climbed to his own room, he didn't have to anymore. January came in hard, bringing with it the kind of cold that made the previous storms seem like gentle warnings. The temperature dropped so low that the water in the pump froze despite Caleb's efforts to keep it flowing, and they had to melt snow in pots on the stove for drinking and cooking. The livestock huddled in the barn, their breath creating clouds of vapor that hung in the still air like fog. Even the wolves went quiet, conserving energy in their dens rather than wasting it on hunting. Caleb and Leanne worked together to keep the ranch functioning through the brutal weather. They checked the animals twice daily, breaking ice in water troughs and distributing extra hay to keep the creatures warm from the inside out. They split wood in shifts, one person working outside while the other warmed by the fire, then switching before frostbite could set in. The work was relentless and exhausting, but there was a strange satisfaction in it, the knowledge that their efforts were all that stood between the animals and death. On the 8th day of the deep freeze, Caleb noticed one of the sheep limping. He brought her into the barn's warmest corner and examined her leg by lamplight, Leanne holding the animal steady while he worked. Abscess, he said, probing gently at the swollen area above the hoof. Needs to be lanced and drained, or it'll spread. I'll hold her. You have a knife sharp enough? Caleb pulled out his pocket knife and held the blade in the lamp flame to sterilize it. The sheep struggled weakly, but Leanne kept her calm with a steady hand on her neck and a low, wordless humming that seemed to soothe the animal. He made the incision quickly and precisely, and infected fluid drained out in a rush. The sheep bleated once, then settled as the pressure released. Good, Leanne said. Now we clean it and wrap it? You've done this before. Different animals, same principle. Infection is infection. She released the sheep carefully. At the mission, we had goats. They got abscesses all the time from walking on rough ground. I learned to treat them. They cleaned the wound with whiskey from Caleb's medical supplies and wrapped the leg with clean cloth. The sheep stood on 3 legs, testing the injured one, then seemed to decide it was tolerable. Caleb guided her back to the pen where she immediately went for the hay, appetite apparently unaffected. She'll need watching, Leanne said. Make sure the infection doesn't come back. I know. But Caleb was studying Leanne rather than the sheep. In the lamplight, her face showed concentration but no distress, no squeamishness about the blood or the smell of infection. She'd held that animal with confidence and competence, reading its distress and responding appropriately. You're good with livestock. I told you, I worked a farm for 2 years. You learn or the animals suffer. She wiped her hands on a rag. Why does that surprise you? Doesn't surprise me. Just confirms what I already suspected. Which is? That you're wasted doing alterations in a mercantile. You've got skills that should be used for more than hemming dresses and fixing torn coats. Leanne looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Garrett used to say I should be grateful he gave me work at all, that someone like me shouldn't expect more than what I had. Garrett's a fool and a cheat. What he said doesn't matter. It mattered for 3 years. Her voice was quiet but firm. When someone tells you every day that you're worth nothing, that you should be grateful for scraps, it becomes hard to believe anything else. Even when you know better in your head, your heart starts to believe it. Caleb set down the lamp and faced her fully. You're worth 50 times what Garrett paid you. More. The work you've done here in 3 weeks, organizing the house, improving the meals, helping with the livestock, planning improvements, that's the work of a partner, not a servant. And you do it all without complaint, without cutting corners, without acting like you're owed something for it. You pay me for it. The money's the least of it. He struggled to find words for something he'd never had to articulate before. You've made this place feel different, better. Not just cleaner or more organized, though it's both those things. You've made it feel less empty. And I didn't realize how empty it was until you were here to fill it. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the sheep moving in their pen and the wind outside the barn walls. Leanne's expression was unreadable in the lamplight, shadows moving across her face as the flame flickered. I should get back to the house, she said finally. The bread needs checking. She left before Caleb could say anything else, moving quickly across the snow-packed yard with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. He stayed in the barn, ostensibly checking on the other animals, but really just giving himself time to understand what he'd just said and why he'd said it. The truth was becoming harder to ignore. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, Leanne had stopped being just hired help and started being something else. A presence. A companion. Someone whose opinion he valued and whose company he actively sought rather than merely tolerated. It was unsettling. He'd built his life around independence, around not needing anyone, around the conviction that solitude was preferable to the complications of human relationship. But Leanne's presence didn't feel like a complication. It felt like the solution to a problem he hadn't known he had. When he finally returned to the house, dinner was on the table. Venison stew with dumplings, simple food made exceptional by careful preparation. They ate in near silence, and afterward Leanne disappeared upstairs to work on the chicken coop plan she'd been drafting. Caleb sat by the fire with a book he'd been meaning to read for months, but the words wouldn't stick in his mind. His thoughts kept drifting upstairs, wondering what she was thinking, whether his words in the barn had offended her, or frightened her, or simply confused her. The next morning, Leanne was up before him again, already working in the kitchen when he came downstairs. She handed him coffee without meeting his eyes. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," she began. "You don't need to—" "Let me finish." Her voice was calm but insistent. "You said I've made this place feel less empty, and I've been thinking about what that means, whether it's just convenience or something more." Caleb wrapped his hands around the coffee cup, waiting. "The truth is, you've done the same for me. Given me a place that doesn't feel like a trap or charity or something I have to constantly prove I deserve. Here, I can work and know the work matters. I can sleep without wondering if someone's going to come take even that small comfort away." She finally looked at him. "So if this place feels less empty to you, that's how I feel too. Less empty. Less like I'm just enduring until something better comes along or something worse happens." "That's good," Caleb said, and meant it. "But it also makes me nervous." Leanne set down the pan she'd been holding. "Because things that feel good have a way of ending, and I don't know if I can go through that again. Having something decent and then watching it disappear. I'm not planning to make it disappear. People don't plan for bad things, they just happen anyway." Caleb set down his coffee and stood. "You're right. Bad things happen whether you plan for them or not. Livestock dies, weather kills crops, banks fail, people get sick. I can't promise none of that will happen, but I can promise I won't be the one to make it happen. You're here because I want you here, and that's not going to change because of weather or money or town gossip or anything else I can control." Leanne studied him, and something in her expression softened. "All right, I believe you." "Good." He moved toward the door. "Now let's get through this cold snap, and when the weather breaks, we'll start on that chicken coop." The weather broke 4 days later with a warm wind from the west that turned the snow to slush and sent meltwater running down every gully and creek. It was still winter, still cold by most standards, but after the deep freeze it felt positively balmy. Caleb and Leon took advantage of the reprieve to tackle outdoor projects that had been waiting. Leon's plans for the chicken coop were thorough and practical. A structure 8 feet by 10 feet, raised off the ground to prevent rot and keep predators out, with nesting boxes, roosting bars, and a covered run where the birds could scratch and peck without being exposed to hawks. She'd calculated materials down to the last nail, using lumber Caleb already had stored in the barn and wire from old fence sections that had been replaced years ago. They worked together on the construction, and Caleb found himself impressed again by her competence. She handled tools with confidence, measuring twice and cutting once, checking corners for square before securing them. When he suggested a modification to the roofing, she considered it seriously and integrated his idea into the design without ego. "Where'd you learn carpentry?" he asked, fitting boards together while she drove nails. "My father, mostly." And the mission had a workshop where they trained some of the girls in practical skills. They figured if we couldn't get married, at least we could work. She tested the join to make sure it was solid. "I liked it better than the domestic work. There's something satisfying about building things that last." "You're good at it." "I'm adequate. You're good at it. There's a difference." "Adequate is better than most people manage." He moved to the next section. "And you're better than adequate. You're just being modest." "I'm being realistic." Modesty would be saying I'm terrible when I know I'm not. Reality is acknowledging that I have skills, but you have more experience. They finished the basic structure by evening, and the next day they added the roof and the nesting boxes. By the end of the week, the coop was complete, sturdy, weathertight, and ready for occupants whenever they could acquire them. Leon stood back and surveyed their work with visible satisfaction. "It's good. Better than I expected, actually. The modifications you suggested for drainage made it stronger. Your design made it possible. I just tweaked details." Caleb tested the door, making sure it opened smoothly. "We'll need to wait until we can get to town for the chickens, though. Could be a few weeks depending on weather." "That's fine. Gives me time to prepare bedding and feeders." She turned to him. "Thank you for letting me do this. You did most of it yourself, but you could have said no. Could have told me it was a waste of time or resources. Instead, you helped make it happen." She paused. "That means something." Before Caleb could respond, a sound cut through the afternoon air, hoofbeats, coming fast up the road from town. Both of them turned to look, and Caleb felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Very few people knew the route to his ranch, and fewer still would make the trip in winter without good reason. A rider emerged from the tree line, pushing his horse hard. As he got closer, Caleb recognized him. Tom Wheeler, one of the few men in Iron Ridge he considered decent. Wheeler worked as a clerk at the land office and occasionally did legal work on the side. Caleb walked out to meet him, Leon following a few steps behind. Wheeler pulled up his horse, the animal breathing hard and steaming in the cold air. "Caleb, glad I caught you." "What's wrong?" "Garrett." Wheeler swung down from the saddle. "He's been making noise in town telling anyone who'll listen that you kidnapped his worker, that he's going to press charges and get the sheriff involved. Let him. He doesn't have a legal leg to stand on." "Maybe not, but he's got influence. He's been talking to the town council, to some of the other merchants. There's a group of them who don't like the precedent this sets. Workers just leaving their employers without notice, outside interference in local business arrangements. They're talking about making an example." Caleb's jaw tightened. "An example of what?" "Of what happens when someone disrupts the established order." Wheeler glanced at Leon, then back to Caleb. "They know they can't touch you directly. You've got too much money and too much land. But they're looking for other angles, claiming she stole from Garrett, maybe, or that she broke a legal contract, something that would force her back under his control." "The contract was illegal." "Was it?" Wheeler pulled a folded paper from his coat. "This is a copy of what Garrett filed with the county 3 years ago. It's not pretty, but it might be legal enough to cause problems. Indenture in exchange for passage from California, room and board, with a term of 5 years before the debt is considered paid." Caleb snatched the paper and read quickly. The language was slippery, carefully worded to sound legitimate while creating a situation that was functionally indistinguishable from slavery. Leon read over his shoulder, her face going pale. "I never agreed to 5 years, she said. He told me 2 years, and that I could leave after that if I wanted." "Do you have that in writing?" She shook her head. Wheeler looked apologetic. Then it's your word against his, and the county has his version on file. In a legal proceeding, that document would carry weight. Then we'll fight it in court, Caleb said. Hire a real lawyer, challenge the contract's validity. You could do that, but court proceedings take time, and in the meantime, there's a question of where she stays. Garrett's arguing that until the matter is resolved, she should be returned to his custody. Absolutely not. Caleb's voice was flat and hard. That's not happening. I didn't think you'd agree, which is why I wrote out to warn you. Wheeler took back the paper. Garrett's planning to come up here with the sheriff tomorrow or the next day. He'll demand she be turned over, and Sheriff Dawson is enough in Garrett's pocket that he might try to enforce it. Dawson can try all he wants. He's not taking her. Caleb. Leon's voice was quiet but firm. You can't fight the sheriff. That would make things worse for both of us. I'm not letting him drag you back to that mercantile. There has to be another way. She turned to Wheeler. The contract says 5 years from when? Wheeler consulted the document. From the date of her arrival in Iron Ridge, which according to this was January 15th, 1882. That's 3 years ago, almost exactly, Leon said, which means I have 2 years left under the contract's terms. Assuming the contract is valid, Wheeler said, which is questionable. But if it is valid, then what Garrett really wants is 2 more years of free labor, correct? Essentially, yes. Leon looked at Caleb. What if we paid him, bought out the contract? I'm not giving that man 1 cent, Caleb said. It's not about him. It's about ending this cleanly, legally, so there's no question later. She kept her voice level despite the tension Caleb could see in her shoulders. 2 years of labor. How much would that be worth in wages? Wheeler did some mental calculation. At fair market rates for skilled seamstress work, maybe $400, but Garrett will ask for more, claim lost business, special training he provided, whatever he can think of to inflate the number. How much more? Could be as high as 1,000. Caleb felt anger rising in his chest, hot and sharp. The idea of paying Garrett anything was repugnant, but he forced himself to think practically. $1,000 was significant money, but it wasn't crippling. He had it, barely, if he liquidated some assets. And if it meant ending this threat permanently, protecting Leanne from being dragged back into servitude, it might be worth it. Would it work? He asked Wheeler. If I paid him whatever ridiculous sum he demands, would that end it legally? If it's done right, with proper documentation showing the contract fulfilled and both parties releasing all claims, yes, it would end it. Wheeler paused. But Caleb, you need to understand, this would be a substantial amount of money for what's essentially blackmail. Garrett would walk away rich while you'd be significantly poorer. I don't care about the money. You should. $1,000 could be the difference between surviving a bad year and losing the ranch. Then I'll be careful not to have a bad year. Caleb looked at Leon. Unless you object to this plan? She was silent for a long moment, her expression troubled. I don't want you to beggar yourself for my sake. You let me worry about my finances. The question is whether you're comfortable with this solution. It feels like letting him win. It feels like paying a bandit to avoid a fight, Caleb said. Sometimes that's the smart play, even if it's not satisfying. We could fight this in court, drag it out for months, spend money on lawyers and risk losing anyway. Or we can end it now, cleanly, and move on with our lives. Leon nodded slowly. All right, if you're sure you can afford it. I can afford it. Caleb turned to Wheeler. Can you act as intermediary? Negotiate with Garrett? Draft the paperwork? I can, but I'll need to move fast if they're planning to come up here in the next day or two. Wheeler glanced at the sky, where clouds were beginning to gather again. And the weather's not going to help. If another storm comes in, I might not make it back to town tonight. Stay here, Leon said immediately. Have dinner, rest your horse. Leave at first light tomorrow if the weather holds. Wheeler looked grateful. I appreciate that, and I'll do my best to get this settled quickly and fairly. Fairly for us, Caleb clarified. I'm not interested in being fair to Garrett. They put Wheeler's horse in the barn and brought the man inside where Leon immediately set about preparing a larger dinner than usual. Wheeler sat at the kitchen table with Caleb, discussing the details of the negotiation. Garrett will smell blood in the water, Wheeler warned. He knows you're motivated to settle this, which means he'll push for the highest number he thinks he can get. Then surprise him. Start low, let him negotiate up, but cap it at 1,000. If he wants more than that, we walk away and take our chances in court. What if he genuinely won't settle for less than, say, 1,500? Caleb hesitated, doing quick mental arithmetic on what he could raise without crippling the ranch's operations. 1,200. Absolute maximum. Beyond that, the risk of court is worth it. Wheeler made notes on a piece of paper Leanne provided. All right, I'll aim for 800, let him push to 1,000, and hold the line there if possible. With luck, we can wrap this up in 2 or 3 days. Over dinner, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. The weather, the livestock, Wheeler's observations about the changing politics of the territory. Leanne listened more than she spoke, but Caleb noticed the tension in her shoulders slowly easing as the meal progressed. By the time she served apple pie made from dried fruit she'd reconstituted, she was even contributing to the conversation, sharing a story about a particularly stubborn goat at the mission that had everyone at the table laughing. Wheeler left early the next morning on a horse rested and well-fed. The weather held clear, and he made good time back toward town. Caleb stood in the yard watching him go, Leanne beside him. "Do you think it'll work?" she asked. "I think Wheeler's smart and careful, and if anyone can negotiate Garrett down to a reasonable number, it's him." Caleb turned toward the barn. "But we should prepare for the possibility it won't. If Garrett refuses to settle, or if the sheriff shows up anyway, we need to be ready." "Ready how?" "Ready to defend what's right, even if the law doesn't agree with us." He met her eyes. "I meant what I said. I'm not letting them take you back." "Even if it means trouble for you?" "Even then." Leanne looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. Then she nodded and went back to the house. The waiting was difficult. Each day seemed to drag, every sound outside making both of them tense, expecting to see riders coming up the road. Caleb kept his rifle cleaned and loaded, not because he planned to use it, but because he wanted options if things went badly. Leanne threw herself into work with even more intensity than usual, as if staying busy could keep the anxiety at bay. 3 days after Wheeler left, he returned. Caleb saw him coming and went out to meet him, Leanne hurrying from the house to join them. Wheeler's expression was neutral, impossible to read. "Well?" Caleb asked. Wheeler dismounted and pulled papers from his saddlebag. "It's done. Garrett settled for $900, and here's the documentation releasing all claims on Miss Jo's labor and person. I had it witnessed by the county clerk and filed with the land office. Legally, she's free." Caleb felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was tight. 900. That's less than I expected. Garrett wanted 12, but I pointed out that in court a judge might invalidate the contract entirely and leave him with nothing. I also may have mentioned that you were prepared to expose some of his less legal business dealings if he pushed too hard. Wheeler looked slightly smug. He settled fast after that. "You're a good negotiator." "I'm a decent lawyer who knows when someone's bluffing versus when they have real leverage. In this case, we had both." He handed the papers to Leanne. "These are yours. Keep them somewhere safe. If Garrett or anyone else ever challenges your right to be here, these documents prove you're a free woman with no debts or obligations to anyone." Leanne took the papers with shaking hands, staring at them as if they might disappear. "I can go anywhere? Do anything?" "Anywhere and anything. You're as free as anyone in this territory." Wheeler smiled. "Congratulations, Miss Jo." She looked up at Caleb, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears. $900. That's more than I could earn in 2 years. "It's worth it," Caleb said simply. Wheeler cleared his throat. "There is one other thing. Garrett had a message for you, Caleb." "I don't care what Garrett has to say. You'll want to hear this. He said, and I'm quoting here, 'Tell Ward he's made an enemy, and enemies in this territory have a way of finding trouble. Let him find it. I'm not worried about Silas Garrett.' Maybe you should be. He's vindictive, and he's got friends on the town council. This might not be over just because the contract is settled." Caleb shrugged. "Then it's not over. But for today, Leanne's free, and that's what matters. The rest we'll deal with if and when it comes." Wheeler stayed for another meal before heading back to town. After he left, Caleb found Leanne in the main room, sitting in the chair by the fire with the legal documents still clutched in her hands. "You all right?" he asked. "I don't know. I feel like I should be happy, relieved, and I am. But I also feel strange, like I've been carrying something heavy for so long that now that it's gone, I don't know how to walk without it." Caleb sat in the chair across from her. "That'll pass. Give it time." $900. She shook her head. "You could have bought cattle with that, equipment, made improvements to the ranch. Instead, you bought me." "I didn't buy you. I bought your freedom. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Either way, I'm in your debt now." "No." Caleb's voice was firm. "You're not in my debt. You work here, I pay you wages. The 900 was separate from that. It was ending an unjust situation, not creating a new obligation. But I can't pay you back. I don't want you to pay me back." He leaned forward, making sure she was looking at him. "Listen to me. That money is gone. Spent. Forgotten. It bought something important, your right to choose your own life. That's worth more to me than cattle or equipment or anything else I could have purchased. So don't carry it as a debt, because I don't consider it one." Leon's eyes searched his face. "Why do you care so much? Really? Not the answer about skilled labor or fairness. The real reason." Caleb had been asking himself the same question for weeks, and he still wasn't entirely sure of the answer, but he tried to give her something honest. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being about hiring help or doing the right thing. It became about you specifically, about wanting you here. Not just someone to cook and clean, but you with your competence and your quiet strength and the way you make this house feel like something more than just a place I sleep. And I didn't realize how lonely I was until you showed me what not being lonely felt like." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Caleb began to wonder if he'd said too much, crossed some line he hadn't even known existed. But then Leanne spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel the same way. About you. About this place. Like maybe I've finally found where I'm supposed to be." "Then stay," Caleb said. "Not because you owe me anything or because you don't have other options. Stay because you want to." "I do want to." She set the papers aside carefully. "And that terrifies me because wanting things has never worked out well for me before. Maybe this time will be different." "Maybe." She smiled then, tentative but real. "I'd like to believe that." Outside, the wind had picked up again, bringing with it the smell of snow. Another storm was coming, but inside the house, the fire burned warm and steady. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the future felt like something to look forward to rather than just endure. The storm Wheeler had outrun arrived that night with the force of something personal, wind screaming down from the peaks and snow falling so thick it erased the world beyond the windows. Caleb woke twice to add wood to the fires, and each time he heard Leanne moving in her room above, restless despite the late hour. By morning, drifts had piled against the north side of the house nearly to the eaves, and the barn was visible only as a dark shape through the white curtain of continuing snowfall. They worked through the storm as they always did, bundled against cold that bit through layers of wool and leather, fighting their way to the barn to tend animals that depended on them for survival. The sheep huddled together for warmth. The horses stamped and snorted, and even the stolid milk cows seemed anxious about the violence of the weather. Caleb and Leanne worked side by side in the lamplight, distributing hay and grain, checking for injuries or illness, their breath forming clouds that merged and dissipated in the frigid air. When they finally made it back to the house, both of them were shaking with cold despite their heavy coats. Leanne put coffee on immediately while Caleb rebuilt the fires to roaring life. They shed their outer layers in silence, hanging ice-crusted garments near the hearth to dry, then wrapped themselves in blankets and sat close to the flames with their hands around steaming cups. "How long will this one last?" Leanne asked. "Hard to say. Could be a day, could be a week." Caleb watched snow pile against the window glass. "We've got supplies to wait it out. Livestock are secure. Nothing to do but ride it through." "I don't mind storms so much anymore." She took a sip of coffee. "They used to frighten me in town. The mercantile was poorly insulated, and my room was so cold I could see my breath even with the stove going. I'd lie awake listening to the wind and wondering if the building would hold. This house has stood for 30 years. It'll stand 30 more. He paused. Your room warm enough? I can bring up more wood if the stove's not keeping up. It's warm, warmer than anywhere I've lived since leaving California. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Sometimes I still can't quite believe I'm here, that I have a room with a good stove and clean blankets and a door I can close, that I can cook in a real kitchen with proper ingredients, that I don't have to ask permission to eat or sleep or speak. You shouldn't have had to ask permission for any of those things in the first place. No, but I did for 3 years, and now I don't, and it still feels strange, like I'm waiting for someone to tell me it was a mistake, that I need to go back. Caleb set down his cup. That's not going to happen. You saw the papers Wheeler brought. Legally, you're free. And even beyond the legal part, I already told you, you're here because I want you here. That hasn't changed, and it's not going to. What if Garrett makes good on his threat? What if he finds a way to cause trouble for you? Then I'll handle it. I've dealt with difficult men before. Not like him. He's vindictive in ways that aren't always obvious at first. He holds grudges, waits for opportunities. Leon's voice carried the weight of experience. When I first started working for him, there was another girl there, Mexican, maybe 16. She complained that he was cheating her on wages, shorting her the money she'd earned. He didn't argue, just smiled and agreed to check his books. 2 days later, the sheriff came and arrested her for theft. Garrett claimed she'd stolen from the till, and he had witnesses, other people who worked for him who swore they'd seen her take the money. Was it true? No, she was honest, more honest than most people I've known. But Garrett had prepared his revenge carefully, and the witnesses were too scared of losing their own positions to tell the truth. She spent 6 months in jail before her family could raise money for a lawyer to appeal. By then, her reputation was destroyed. She couldn't find work anywhere in the territory. Caleb felt cold that had nothing to do with the storm. What happened to her? I don't know. She left Montana, went south maybe. I never heard from her again. Leon looked at him directly. That's what I mean when I say he's dangerous. He doesn't just lash out in anger. He plans. He waits. He finds the way to hurt people that causes the most damage. Then we'll be careful. Watch for signs of trouble. Keep our guard up. I don't want you hurt because of me. And I don't want you living in fear because of him. Caleb leaned forward. Listen to me. Garrett is a small man with small power in a small town. He can make noise, but out here, on my land, he has no authority. And if he tries to manufacture charges or false accusations, he'll find I'm not as easy a target as a 16-year-old girl with no resources. You have resources, but you also have things to lose. The ranch, your reputation, your freedom if he manages to frame you for something. Those are risks I'm willing to take. Why? The question came out sharp, frustrated. Why are you willing to risk so much for someone you barely know? I know you well enough. Caleb stood and moved to the window, looking out at the storm. I know you're honest and hardworking. I know you have more courage than most people I've met, because you survived 3 years of exploitation without becoming bitter or broken. I know you care about doing things right, not just doing them fast or easy. And I know that in the few weeks you've been here, you've made me remember what it feels like to have a reason to come home at the end of the day. The silence behind him stretched long enough that he turned to see Leanne staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Surprise, perhaps, mixed with something softer. You make it sound like more than just employer and employee, she said quietly. Maybe it is. What does that mean? Caleb struggled with words that had never come easily to him. It means I value your company. It means I respect you as a person, not just a worker. It means when I think about the future of this ranch, I find myself hoping you'll be part of it, not out of necessity, but because I want you to be. Leanne set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. Caleb, I need to understand what you're saying. Are you offering me permanent employment, or are you saying something else? I'm saying I don't know exactly what this is yet, but I know it matters to me. And I think it might matter to you too, or you wouldn't be asking these questions. She stood and crossed to where he stood by the window. They were close enough that he could see the lamplight reflected in her dark eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her despite the cold pressing in from outside. It does matter to me, she said, more than I expected it to, more than I'm entirely comfortable with, because caring about things has always led to losing them, and I don't know if I can survive losing this." "Then don't lose it. Stay. Not just for now, but for as long as you want. Let this be home, not just a place you're staying until something better comes along." "What if nothing better comes along? What if this is as good as it gets?" "Then we're both lucky, because this is already better than most people ever find." Leon reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the window frame. Her fingers were small and calloused from work, warm against his skin. "I'm afraid," she admitted, "of hoping for too much, of believing this could last." "I'm afraid too," Caleb said, and the admission surprised him even as he made it. "I'm afraid of caring about someone again after convincing myself I was better off alone. I'm afraid of failing you the way I failed to protect this ranch from the people who stole from my father. I'm afraid that somehow I'll prove everyone in town right when they say I'm too hard, too isolated, too damaged by solitude to connect with another person. You're none of those things. Hard, maybe, but not damaged. Just careful. Just protecting yourself the only way you knew how. So are you." She smiled then, tentative but genuine. "We're a pair of careful, frightened people trying to figure out how to stop being so alone. Seems like a good start." Outside, the wind howled and snow continued to fall, but inside the house, something had shifted. Not resolved exactly, but acknowledged. The space between them held possibility now, fragile and uncertain, but undeniably present. They spent the rest of the storm day in companionable proximity, working on indoor tasks that had been neglected during better weather. Leon mended clothes and organized the pantry while Caleb repaired tack and sharpened tools. They talked more than usual, sharing stories from their pasts, her childhood in China and California, his memories of the ranch before his father died. The conversations revealed layers they'd both kept hidden, small vulnerabilities offered carefully and received with respect. By evening, when they sat down to dinner, the awkwardness had faded into something more comfortable. Leon had made a stew from salt pork and dried vegetables, simple food elevated by her skill, and they ate while the fire crackled and the storm continued its assault on the world outside. "Tell me about your father," Leon said. "What was he like?" Caleb considered the question. Tough, fair. He had high standards and didn't tolerate laziness or dishonesty. But he was also generous with people who worked hard, and he believed in paying fair wages even when other ranchers were cutting corners. "You're like him. In some ways. In others, I think I'm softer than he was. He could fire a man without hesitation if that man wasn't pulling his weight. I tend to give more chances, make more excuses. That's how I ended up with a crew that was stealing from me. I kept thinking they'd improve, that I just needed to give them more time. That's not softness. That's hoping for the best in people. There's nothing wrong with that. There is when it costs you livestock and equipment and a year's worth of profit. So you learned, adjusted, became more careful without becoming cruel. That's wisdom, not weakness." Leon served him more stew. "Your father would be proud of what you've built here. The ranch is thriving, the land is well maintained, the livestock are healthy. You've done all of that alone, which is more than most men could manage with a full crew. It's been harder than it needed to be. I can admit that now." Caleb met her eyes across the table. "Having you here has shown me how much easier things are when you have someone you can trust to share the work. Not just the physical labor, but the planning, the thinking, the problem solving. It's better than being alone. For me too." They cleaned up together after dinner, working in the comfortable synchronization they'd developed over weeks of shared routine. When the kitchen was clean, they moved to the main room where the fire had burned down to coals. Caleb built it back up while Leon settled into her usual chair with mending in her lap. The evening passed quietly, each of them absorbed in their own tasks, but aware of the other's presence. It was peaceful in a way that Caleb had almost forgotten was possible. Not the empty silence of solitude, but the full silence of companionship. The storm blew itself out overnight, and morning came clear and brutally cold. The world outside was transformed, snow piled high in drifts that altered the familiar landscape into something strange and beautiful. Caleb and Leon spent the day digging out paths to the barn and the other outbuildings, breaking ice in the water troughs, checking on animals that had weathered the storm safely in their shelters. By afternoon, the work was done, and they stood in the yard looking out at the pristine snowfield that stretched toward the mountains. The sun was already sinking toward the western peaks, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold. "It's beautiful," Leon said. "Deadly, like you said, but beautiful. Most worthwhile things are. Beautiful and dangerous, requiring respect and care." She glanced at him, and he wondered if she caught the double meaning in his words. But she didn't comment, just turned back to the view with a small smile. That night, as Caleb lay in his bed listening to the house settle around him, he found himself thinking about the future with more hope than he'd allowed himself in years. The ranch was stable. The livestock were healthy. He had enough money set aside to weather bad years, even after the payment to Garrett. And he had Leon, whose presence had transformed his solitary existence into something richer and more meaningful. It wasn't perfect. Garrett's threat still hung over them, a shadow waiting to solidify into something concrete. The town's opinion of his interference in local business arrangements could cause problems he hadn't anticipated, and the feelings developing between him and Leanne were complicated by their employer-employee relationship and the power imbalance inherent in it. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Caleb felt like the future held promise rather than just obligation. 2 weeks passed in relative peace. The weather remained cold but clear, perfect for the winter work of the ranch. Caleb took a load of pelts to town and returned with supplies and news. Garrett was keeping quiet, focused on his mercantile and apparently not making trouble. The talk about pressing charges or involving the sheriff had died down, dismissed as empty threats once the contract buyout was settled. Wheeler had stopped by the ranch one afternoon to deliver the final paperwork and collect his fee for the negotiation. He'd stayed for coffee and conversation, clearly pleased with how smoothly things had resolved. "Garrett's backed down completely," Wheeler reported. "Won't even mention Miss Joe's name in public anymore. I think he realizes he came out ahead financially and doesn't want to risk losing that by stirring up more trouble." "Good," Caleb said. "Let's hope it stays that way." "I expect it will. Men like Garrett are bullies at heart. Once they realize someone won't back down, they usually find easier targets." Wheeler paused. "Though I'd still be watchful, just in case." After Wheeler left, Caleb found Leon in the kitchen preparing dinner. She looked up when he entered, reading something in his expression. "Wheeler thinks the threat is over," Caleb said. "Do you believe him?" "I want to, but I agree with you that Garrett isn't the type to forget or forgive easily. So we stay alert." Leon nodded and returned to her work. But Caleb noticed she seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight she'd been carrying had eased slightly. That night at dinner, she talked about plans for the spring garden, where she wanted to plant vegetables and herbs, what crops would grow best at this elevation. It was the first time she'd discussed plans extending beyond the next few weeks, and Caleb took it as a good sign. February arrived with slightly warmer temperatures and the first signs that winter might eventually release its grip. The sheep began lambing, and Caleb and Leon spent long hours in the barn helping with difficult births and making sure the newborn stayed warm and fed. It was exhausting work, but there was satisfaction in seeing the small creatures survive and thrive despite the harsh conditions. One evening, after a particularly difficult delivery that had required both of them working together to save the lamb, they sat in the barn catching their breath. The newborn lamb was nursing strongly, the ewe standing calm and protective over her baby. "We make a good team," Leon observed. "We do." "I've been thinking about something." She turned to face him. "About what happens when spring comes and the weather improves, when traveling becomes easier." Caleb felt his stomach tighten. "Are you planning to leave?" "No, but I'm planning to go to town, to be seen there, to make it clear that I'm living here by choice, not by force or coercion. I don't want rumors starting that you're keeping me prisoner or that I'm hiding because I've done something wrong." "That's wise. Though I should warn you, the town gossips will have plenty to say regardless." "Let them. I've endured worse than gossip." She stood and brushed hay from her skirt. "But I want you to understand. When I go to town, when I face whatever judgment or curiosity people direct at me, I'll be doing it as myself. Not as your employee or your dependent, but as a free woman who's chosen to live here. I wouldn't want it any other way." "Good. Because I need to know that you see me that way too. Not as someone you saved or someone who owes you, but as an equal partner in making this ranch work." Caleb stood and faced her directly. "I see you as someone I respect and value. Someone whose opinion I trust and whose company I prefer to solitude. Someone who's proven herself capable and resilient and fundamentally decent. If that's not seeing you as an equal, then I don't know what is. Leanne searched his face, and whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her. All right. Then when spring comes, we'll go to town together. Face whatever comes, together. Together, Caleb agreed. But spring was still weeks away, and before it could arrive, Garrett's promised revenge would materialize in a form neither of them anticipated. It started with a rumor, as these things often did. Caleb heard it first from Tompkins when he stopped at the livery to pick up some tack he'd left for repair. The old soldier mentioned it casually, almost apologetically, while Caleb was inspecting the mended bridle. "There's talk in town," Tompkins said. "Stupid talk, the kind that comes from people with too much time and too little sense. But I figured you should know about it." "What kind of talk?" "About you and Miss Joe. About the arrangement you've got up at the ranch." Tompkins looked uncomfortable. "Some folks are saying it's improper. A single man and a single woman living under one roof without benefit of marriage, or even a chaperone. They're calling it scandalous." Caleb felt anger rising, but kept his voice level. "Let me guess. This talk started with Garrett?" "Can't say for certain where it started, but Garrett's definitely encouraging it. He's been making comments about how he tried to provide Miss Joe with respectable employment, and you corrupted her into a situation that damages her reputation." Tompkins shook his head. "Like I said, stupid talk, but it's getting louder." "Thanks for the warning." Caleb rode home with his jaw tight and his mind working. He'd anticipated that Garrett might try legal action or false accusations, but he hadn't considered the weapon of social pressure. In a small frontier town where reputation mattered and women's virtue was supposedly precious, the suggestion of impropriety could be damaging even without any truth behind it. He found Leanne in the house working on her plans for the spring garden. She looked up when he entered, and her expression shifted immediately. "What's wrong?" He told her about the rumors, watching her face carefully for signs of distress or fear. Instead, he saw anger. "He's trying to force me back by destroying my reputation," she said flatly. "Making it so I can't show my face in town without people whispering about me. Making it so any other employment I might seek would be tainted by scandal." "That's my read on it, too." "What do we do?" Caleb had been thinking about that on the ride home. There were several options, none of them perfect. They could ignore the rumors and hope they died down, but that rarely worked. They could confront Garrett directly, but that might escalate the situation. Or they could address the supposed impropriety head-on in a way that cut the ground from under Garrett's attack. "We could hire a housekeeper," he suggested. "An older woman from town to serve as chaperone. That would satisfy the propriety concerns. And cost you money you don't need to spend while giving credibility to the idea that there's something wrong with our current arrangement." Leanne shook her head. "No, that's letting them win." "Then what do you suggest?" She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was steady despite the weight of what she was proposing. "We get married." Caleb stared at her. "What?" "You heard me? We get married, make it legal and official, and then there's nothing improper about us living under the same roof. The rumors lose all their power." "Leanne, that's not something you do just to solve a problem." "Why not? People marry for all kinds of reasons: money, land, convenience, family obligation. At least we'd be marrying because we respect each other and work well together. That's more than most couples start with." "But marriage is—" Caleb struggled to articulate his objection. "It's permanent. It's a commitment that goes beyond just living together or working together." "I know what marriage is." Her voice was firm. "And I'm saying I'm willing to make that commitment if you are. Not because I feel pressured or because I don't have other options, but because I genuinely think we could build a good life together. We already work well as partners. We respect each other. We enjoy each other's company. Those are better foundations than love that fades or passion that burns out." "What about love?" Caleb asked quietly. Leanne met his eyes. "What about it? I care for you, Caleb, more than I've cared for anyone in a very long time. Maybe that's not the romantic love people write poems about, but it's real and it's substantial and it's enough to build something lasting on. Isn't it?" Caleb felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. 2 months ago, he'd been alone on this ranch, convinced that solitude was what he wanted. Now he was being offered partnership, companionship, a future that included someone else's hopes and dreams alongside his own. It was terrifying. It was also exactly what he wanted, even if he hadn't fully admitted it until this moment. "Yes," he heard himself say. "It's enough." Leon's expression softened. So you'll consider it? I'm not considering it, I'm agreeing to it. Caleb crossed the room to stand in front of her. If you're sure this is what you want, then yes, let's get married. Not just to solve Garrett's attack, but because you're right. We work well together, we respect each other, and I can't imagine going back to living here alone now that I know what it's like to share it with you. You're sure? Are you? She smiled then, genuine and warm. Yes, I'm sure. They stood there in the kitchen, the winter sun slanting through the windows and dust motes dancing in the light, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. We should do it soon, Leon said practically, before Garrett can do more damage with his rumors. Agreed. I'll ride to town tomorrow, talk to Wheeler about the legal requirements, arrange for a ceremony. Caleb paused. Unless you want something elaborate? A church wedding, guests, all the traditional elements? No, simple is fine, just us, the legal requirements, maybe Wheeler and Tompkins as witnesses. I don't need ceremony, I just need it to be real. It'll be real. That night, lying in his bed, Caleb tried to process what he'd agreed to. Marriage, partnership, a permanent joining of his life with someone else's. It should have felt overwhelming, frightening, like a trap closing around him. Instead, it felt right. Like a decision he'd been moving toward without realizing it, from the moment he'd watched Leanne repair his boot with such precise care in Garrett's mercantile. She'd been showing him who she was that day, competent, dignified, skilled, honest, and everything he'd learned about her since had only confirmed that initial impression. He thought about his father, who'd married for love and lost his wife young, but never regretted the years they'd had. He thought about the ranch, which needed more than one person to truly thrive. And he thought about the future, which suddenly seemed less like an obligation to be endured and more like a possibility to be embraced. Tomorrow, he would ride to town and set in motion the events that would make Leon Jo his wife. And if Garrett wanted to call that scandalous, let him. Caleb was done caring about the opinions of small men with small minds. He was building something better than reputation. He was building a life worth living. Morning came with the kind of clarity that only followed the deepest cold, the air so crisp it seemed to ring like crystal when Caleb stepped outside. He'd been awake since before dawn, planning the trip to town with the careful attention he usually reserved for moving cattle or preparing for storms. This was different, though. This was about building something rather than just surviving something, and the distinction made him more nervous than he cared to admit. Leon was already in the kitchen when he came downstairs, and the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the house with warmth that went beyond temperature. She turned when she heard him, and their eyes met across the room with an understanding that didn't require words. "You're still sure about this?" he asked. "I am. Are you?" "Yes." She nodded and returned to the stove. "Then you should go soon. The weather's holding, but that could change by afternoon, and the sooner this is done, the sooner Garrett's ammunition is gone." Caleb ate quickly, aware that every hour mattered. When he stood to leave, Leon walked him to the door and handed him a list she'd written. "Supplies we'll need," she explained, "if you have time after the legal business is handled. And this—" She pressed a small cloth bundle into his hand. "It's money. My wages from the past 2 months. I want to contribute to the household expenses, especially now." "Leon, you don't need to—" "I do need to. We're going to be partners in this. Equal partners. That means I pay my share." Her voice was gentle but firm. "Please, let me do this." He nodded and tucked the bundle into his coat pocket. Then on impulse, he reached out and squeezed her hand briefly. Her fingers tightened around his for just a moment before letting go. "Be careful," she said. "Always am." The ride to Iron Ridge took less time than usual, Della moving with the easy confidence of a horse on familiar ground. The town appeared from the winter landscape looking almost picturesque, smoke rising from chimneys and sunlight gleaming off snow-covered roofs. But Caleb knew better than to trust appearances. Underneath the peaceful exterior, Iron Ridge was a place where gossip spread faster than fire, and reputations could be destroyed with nothing more than whispered speculation. He went to Wheeler's office first, a small room above the land office that served as the man's legal practice. Wheeler looked up from his desk when Caleb entered, surprise flickering across his face. "Caleb, didn't expect to see you again so soon. Everything all right at the ranch?" "Everything's fine. I need your help with something." Caleb removed his hat and sat in the chair across from Wheeler's desk. I want to get married, to Leon, as soon as legally possible. Wheeler's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Well, that's unexpected. Though I suppose given the rumors circulating, it makes a certain kind of sense. It's not just about the rumors, but they're part of it, yes. Fair enough. Marriage is the most effective way to silence that particular kind of gossip. Wheeler pulled out a clean sheet of paper and dipped his pen in ink. You'll need a license from the county clerk, which I can help you obtain. There's a 3-day waiting period unless you can show cause for expediting it. Given the circumstances and the malicious nature of the rumors, I think I can make that argument successfully. How soon could we do the ceremony? If I file the paperwork today and argue for immediate approval, you could be married by tomorrow afternoon. You'll need 2 witnesses and someone authorized to perform the ceremony. I can do that. I'm a notary and a justice of the peace. Tomorrow afternoon works. Caleb leaned forward. What else do I need to know? Legal requirements, complications, anything that could cause problems? Wheeler tapped his pen against the paper thoughtfully. The ceremony itself is straightforward. Both parties state their consent, witnesses sign, I sign. It's recorded with the county. You'll want to think about property rights, though. Montana Territory has community property laws that could affect how your ranch is classified after marriage. Meaning anything acquired during the marriage belongs equally to both spouses. Property you owned before the marriage typically remains separate unless you choose to deed it jointly. Given that you own the ranch outright, you might want to consider how you want that structured. Caleb didn't hesitate. Joint ownership. Everything I have becomes ours, not just mine. That's the point of partnership. You're certain? That's a significant decision, Caleb. You're talking about land and assets worth considerable money. I'm certain. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. No halfway measures, no holding back just in case things don't work out. Full partnership or nothing. Wheeler studied him for a long moment. All right, I'll draft the deed transfer to include her name alongside yours. It'll be ready by tomorrow. He made notes on his paper. You'll need 2 witnesses for the ceremony. Do you have anyone in mind? You'll be one, if you're willing. And maybe Tompkins. He's about the only other person in this town I trust completely. I'm honored, and Tompkins is a good choice. He's respected, and his presence will lend credibility to the proceedings. Wheeler set down his pen. I have to ask, though, are you doing this because you want to marry Miss Joe, or because you feel pressured by circumstances into a solution you wouldn't otherwise choose? Both, Caleb said honestly. The pressure exists, I won't deny that. But I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't want to. Leon and I work well together. We respect each other. We built something good at the ranch over the past 2 months, and I want to make that permanent. The rumors just gave us a reason to act sooner rather than later. And Miss Joe feels the same way? She does. It was her suggestion, actually. Wheeler smiled. Smart woman. Very well, I'll handle the legal arrangements. You should probably visit the mercantile for supplies and make your presence known in town. Let people see you're not hiding or ashamed. That'll help with the gossip in the long run. Caleb stood. About the mercantile, I assume Garrett still owns it? He does. And he'll probably be there, given that it's his primary source of income. Good. Time I had a word with him anyway. Wheeler's expression turned cautious. Caleb, I'd advise against confrontation. It could complicate. I'm not going to hit him if that's what you're worried about. But he needs to understand that his campaign of rumor and innuendo stops now, one way or another. The mercantile looked exactly as Caleb remembered it. The same large windows, the same crowded shelves, the same general air of commerce conducted without much care for customer satisfaction. He pushed through the door, and the bell above it announced his arrival with a cheerful jangle that felt incongruous given the tension in his shoulders. Garrett was behind the counter, and his face went through several expressions in rapid succession when he saw who'd entered. Surprise, wariness, calculation, and finally a kind of oily confidence that made Caleb's hands curl into fists. Well, Caleb Ward. Back in town already. Garrett's voice was loud enough to carry to the other customers browsing the shelves. What can I do for you? Come to return my stolen property? I came to buy supplies. But since you brought it up, let's talk about property. Caleb moved to the counter, keeping his voice level despite the anger simmering beneath it. Leon Joe isn't your property and never was. We've already established that legally. so you can stop spreading rumors suggesting otherwise. Rumors? Garrett's expression was the picture of wounded innocence. I don't know what you're talking about. I simply expressed concern for Miss Jo's reputation, given that she's living in an improper situation with a man who what? Who offered her honest work and fair wages? Who treats her with respect instead of exploitation? Caleb leaned forward slightly. Let me make something very clear, Garrett. The situation at my ranch is none of your business and hasn't been since the day you accepted $900 to release your illegal claim on her labor. But since you seem determined to make it your business, I'll give you something new to talk about. And what would that be? Leanne and I are getting married tomorrow, legally and publicly. So whatever rumors you've been spreading about impropriety, they end now. Understood? The color drained from Garrett's face, then rushed back in a tide of red. You're marrying her? A Chinese girl? You could have any woman in this territory, any decent white woman from a good family, and you're choosing to marry the most capable, honest, hard-working person I've ever met, Caleb interrupted, his voice sharp as broken glass. Who happens to be Chinese, yes. If that bothers you or anyone else in this town, that's your problem, not mine. The town council won't approve. They'll never accept. I don't need the town council's approval to marry who I choose on my own property. And frankly, Garrett, I don't care what you or they accept. I stopped caring about this town's opinion the day I realized most of it was formed by small-minded men like you who measure worth by skin color instead of character. Garrett's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Other customers in the store had stopped pretending to shop and were openly staring now, bearing witness to a confrontation that would be all over Iron Ridge by nightfall. Now, Caleb continued, pulling out Leanne's list, I came here to buy supplies. You want my business? You can fill this order and keep your opinions to yourself. You want to refuse me service because you don't approve of who I'm marrying? That's your right as a business owner. But understand that if you refuse, I'll make sure every rancher in the territory knows that Garrett's Mercantile doesn't serve customers based on the merchant's personal prejudices. Your choice. Garrett snatched the list from Caleb's hand, his jaw working with barely suppressed fury. He read through it quickly, then shoved it at his current clerk, a nervous-looking young man who'd been watching the exchange with wide eyes. Fill it, Garrett snapped, and pack it careful. Wouldn't want Mr. Ward to have any complaints about the quality of our service. While the clerk gathered supplies, Caleb stood at the counter in silence, very aware of the other customers whispering behind him. Let them whisper. By tomorrow, the whole town would know he was marrying Leanne, and the whispers would shift from scandal to curiosity to eventual acceptance or continued disapproval. Either way, it wouldn't matter. They'd be married and their life would continue at the ranch regardless of what Iron Ridge thought about it. When the supplies were packed, Caleb paid, using both his money and Leanne's contribution, and loaded everything onto Della with methodical care. As he worked, Tompkins appeared from the direction of the livery. Heard you were in town, the old soldier said. News travels fast. I'm learning that. Caleb secured the last bundle. You got a minute? I have a favor to ask. They walked to the livery together, and Caleb explained the situation, the rumors, the decision to marry, the ceremony planned for tomorrow. Tompkins listened without interruption, his weathered face thoughtful. You're sure about this? He asked when Caleb finished. Not that I'm questioning Miss Jo's worth, but marriage is a big step, especially under these circumstances. I'm sure this isn't just about solving a problem, it's about building something lasting with someone I respect and care about. The timing might be forced, but the decision isn't. Tompkins nodded slowly. Then I'd be honored to stand witness. What time tomorrow? Wheeler's handling the details, but probably mid-afternoon. I'll confirm tonight and let you know. I'll be there. Tompkins paused. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Miss Jo's good people, and you two seem well suited. Don't let the town gossips make you doubt that. I won't. Thanks, Tompkins. Caleb rode home as the afternoon sun started its descent toward the western peaks, painting the snow in shades of rose and amber. His mind was full of details, the legal arrangements, the ceremony logistics, the supplies he'd purchased. Garrett's barely contained rage. But underneath all of it ran a current of something he hadn't felt in years. Not quite excitement, but anticipation. The sense of moving towards something good, rather than just away from something bad. Leanne met him at the barn, helping him unload supplies in the fading light. She didn't ask about the town or the arrangements, just worked alongside him with her usual efficiency until everything was stored properly and Della was settled for the night. It was only when they were walking back to the house, snow crunching under their boots, that she spoke. How did it go? Wheeler can do the ceremony tomorrow afternoon. Tompkins agreed to witness. I filed the paperwork for the license and deed transfer. Caleb paused. I also had a conversation with Garrett. Should I be worried? No, I made it clear that his rumor campaign ends now. He wasn't happy, but he's smart enough to know when he's beaten. The whole town will know by tomorrow morning that we're getting married, which means the scandal he was trying to create is already dead. Leanne was quiet for a few steps. Did he say anything about me? About your choice to marry someone Chinese? Yes, and I told him I don't care about his opinion or anyone else's on that subject. Caleb stopped walking and turned to face her. I need you to understand something. I'm not marrying you despite you being Chinese. I'm marrying you because you're you, your skills, your character, your strength, everything that makes you who you are. If people in town have a problem with that, it's their problem, not ours. The last light of day caught in Leanne's eyes, making them shine with something that might have been tears or might have been just reflection. Thank you for seeing me as a person rather than just a category. It's the only way I've ever seen you. They stood in the snow as the sun dropped below the mountains and the sky turned from rose to purple to deep blue, neither of them speaking because sometimes silence said more than words ever could. The next day dawned clear and cold, perfect weather for a winter wedding that neither of them had quite planned but both of them wanted. Leanne rose early and threw herself into preparations, not for ceremony, because they'd agreed to keep things simple, but for the day itself. She baked bread and prepared a special dinner using some of the supplies Caleb had brought from town. She cleaned the house until it gleamed, arranged flowers made from paper she'd been working on secretly for weeks, made everything as beautiful as their simple circumstances allowed. Caleb watched her work and understood that this was her way of making the day matter, of turning a practical solution into something worth celebrating. So he helped where he could, chopping wood and filling water jugs and doing the small tasks that freed her to focus on the larger ones. At noon, Wheeler arrived with the completed paperwork, and an hour later, Tompkins rode up on his old cavalry horse. They gathered in the main room of the ranch house, the four of them standing near the fireplace while winter light streamed through the windows. Wheeler unfolded the marriage license and looked at both Caleb and Leanne. Before we begin, I need to confirm that you both enter into this marriage of your own free will, with full understanding of the legal and personal commitment involved. I do, Leanne said clearly. I do, Caleb echoed. Very well. Wheeler produced a small book from his coat pocket, a civil ceremony guide. We'll keep this brief and direct, as requested. Caleb Ward. Do you take Leanne Jo to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, richer or poorer, in sickness and health, for as long as you both shall live? I do. Leanne Jo, do you take Caleb Ward to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, richer or poorer, in sickness and health, for as long as you both shall live? I do. Do you have rings to exchange? They hadn't discussed rings, and Caleb felt a moment of panic at the oversight. But Leanne reached into her pocket and produced two simple bands made from braided copper wire, something she must have fashioned herself from scrap material. These will serve, she said quietly, handing one to Caleb. They exchanged the makeshift rings, and Caleb was surprised by how much weight the simple gesture carried. The copper was warm from Leanne's pocket, and when he slid it onto her finger, it fit perfectly. She did the same for him, her small hand steady despite the significance of what they were doing. Wheeler smiled. Then, by the authority vested in me by Montana Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. What has been joined here today, let no one separate. It was done. Simple as that. No church bells, no crowd of witnesses, no elaborate ceremony. Just four people in a ranch house making something official that had already been growing between them for weeks. Tompkins shook Caleb's hand firmly and gave Leanne a gentle embrace. Congratulations to you both. May you have long years and good fortune together." Wheeler had them sign the license, then added his own signature and Tompkins' witness mark. "This is now legal and binding. I'll file it with the county tomorrow, along with the deed transfer making you joint owners of the ranch." He handed Caleb a copy of each document. "Keep these safe. They're your proof of marriage and property rights." After Wheeler and Tompkins left, riding back toward town in the afternoon light, Caleb and Leon stood alone in the house that was now officially theirs together. The silence felt different somehow, charged with awareness of what had just happened. "So?" Leon said. "We're married." "We are." "Does anything feel different?" Caleb considered the question. "Everything and nothing. I feel the same, but also changed. Like I've been given permission to want something I was already wanting, but didn't know how to acknowledge." "What were you wanting?" "This. You. A partnership that goes beyond just working together. A future that's ours instead of just mine with you as a temporary addition." Leon crossed the room and took his hands in hers. The copper rings glinted in the firelight, rough and imperfect, but unmistakably real. "I want those things too. I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to hope for them. Afraid that hoping would make it hurt worse when it inevitably ended. It's not going to end. We just made that permanent." "I know. And that still feels strange. Wonderful, but strange." She smiled up at him. "We should eat. I made dinner and it'll be cold if we don't have it soon." The meal she'd prepared was extraordinary. Roasted chicken with herbs she'd dried from her garden plants, potatoes cooked with butter and salt, fresh bread with honey, and a pie made from preserved berries. It was the kind of feast that spoke of celebration and care, and they ate slowly, savoring both the food and the moment. Afterward, as they cleaned up together in the kitchen that was now officially theirs as a couple, Leon said something that had clearly been on her mind. "We should go to town, soon, together, as husband and wife. Make our presence known so there's no question about the legitimacy of our marriage or the status of our relationship." "Agreed. Give Garrett and his gossips no room to maneuver." Caleb dried a plate and set it on the shelf. "Though I warn you, there will still be talk. Some people won't approve no matter how legal and proper everything is. Let them disapprove. Their opinions don't change the facts. We're married, we own this ranch together, and we're building a life here that doesn't require their approval or understanding. You've become very fierce since leaving the mercantile." "I've always been fierce. I just had to hide it before because showing it would have cost me everything." She turned to face him, her expression serious. "But I'm done hiding, Caleb. I'm done making myself small so other people feel comfortable. This is my home now, our home, and I'm going to defend it and our right to live here in peace." Caleb felt pride surge through him at her words. This was the woman he'd married, not the quiet, careful seamstress from Garrett's shop, but someone stronger and more complete, someone who'd been there all along waiting for a chance to emerge. "Then we'll defend it together," he said. They rode into Iron Ridge together 3 days later, on a morning so cold that the horse's breath formed clouds that hung in the air like fog. Word of their marriage had already spread through the town, carried by Wheeler and Tompkins, and probably half a dozen gossips who'd overheard Caleb's confrontation with Garrett at the mercantile. As they rode down Main Street, Caleb was very aware of people watching from windows and doorways, their faces showing everything from curiosity to disapproval to outright hostility. Leanne sat straight in her saddle, her chin up and her expression calm. If she felt the weight of those stares, she didn't show it. They stopped first at the land office, where they filed official notice of their marriage and the joint property deed. Then they visited this general store, not Garrett's Mercantile, but the smaller establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, one of the few other Chinese residents of Iron Ridge. Mrs. Chen's face lit up when she saw Leanne, and she spoke rapidly in Chinese, her words tumbling over each other with excitement. Leanne responded in kind, and though Caleb couldn't understand the conversation, he caught his own name several times and saw Mrs. Chen glance at him with expressions that ranged from surprise to approval. When they finally switched back to English, Mrs. Chen beamed at both of them. "Congratulations on your marriage. It's good to see Miss Joe with someone who treats her well. And Mr. Ward, you've chosen wisely. She's one of the finest people I know." "I know," Caleb said simply. "That's why I married her." They bought supplies from Mrs. Chenin spent time talking with her about everything from the weather to plans for spring planting. Other customers came and went, and Caleb noticed that several of them greeted Leanne with warmth and respect, treating her as Mrs. Ward rather than as Garrett's former employee. The town's opinion was clearly divided, but there were enough people willing to accept the marriage that Caleb felt his concerns about social ostracism easing. The real test came when they left Mrs. Chen's store and found Silas Garrett standing in the street outside, clearly waiting for them. "Well," Garrett said, his voice carrying in the cold air, "if it isn't the happy couple. Come to show off your victory?" Caleb felt Leanne tense beside him, but he kept his own voice level. "We came to conduct business, same as anyone else. We're not looking for confrontation, Garrett." "No? Because it seems to me you've done everything possible to interfere with my livelihood, steal my employees, and make me look like a fool in front of the entire town. You did that yourself when you tried to keep a person in indentured servitude and then spread rumors when your illegal arrangement was challenged." Caleb kept himself between Garrett and Leanne, a subtle but deliberate positioning. If you want to blame someone for your current situation, blame yourself. "She's Chinese." Garrett's voice climbed toward a shout. "You married a Chinese girl and expect this town to accept it? To accept her as a respectable wife when she's nothing but—" "Finish that sentence and you'll regret it," Caleb interrupted, his voice going cold and flat. "My wife's heritage is none of your concern, and neither is our marriage. You've lost, Garrett, legally, financially, and morally. The smart thing would be to accept that and move on. But if you want to keep fighting, keep spreading poison about my wife, then understand that I will respond. And I have resources you don't, connections you can't match, and information about your business practices that could destroy you if it reached the right ears." Garrett's face went purple. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm stating facts. You started this by exploiting someone vulnerable and then trying to ruin her reputation when she escaped your control. I'm ending it by making sure you understand that continuing on this path will cost you more than you can afford to lose." Caleb paused. "Walk away, Garrett. Close this chapter, focus on your business, and leave us alone. That's the only smart play you have left." For a long moment, Garrett stood there, visibly struggling with rage and calculation. Around them, the street had gone silent, everyone within earshot frozen and listening to the confrontation. Finally, Garrett spat into the snow at his feet and turned away, shoving past several onlookers in his haste to get distance from Caleb and Leanne. He didn't look back. Caleb felt the tension drain from his shoulders. It wasn't quite victory. Garrett would probably nurse his grudge for years, but it was resolution. The threat had been neutralized, at least for now. Leanne touched his arm lightly. "We should go home." "Yes, we should." They rode out of Iron Ridge together in the late morning light, leaving behind a town that would talk about this confrontation for weeks. But as they climbed into the foothills and the ranch came into view, Caleb realized he didn't care what the town said. He'd defended his wife, protected their right to live in peace, and established boundaries that even Garrett would think twice about crossing. Spring came late to the high country, but when it finally arrived, it transformed the world. Snow melted in rushing torrents, filling creeks and rivers. The meadows turned green almost overnight, carpeted with wildflowers in colors that seemed too bright to be real. The livestock grew fat on new grass, and the sheep produced wool so thick and healthy that Caleb knew it would bring top prices when he could get it to market. Leanne's chicken coop filled with birds, 20 pullets purchased from a farmer down the valley, young and healthy and already beginning to lay eggs. She tended them with the same focused care she brought to everything, and within weeks they had more eggs than two people could eat. The surplus went to Mrs. Chen's store in town, traded for supplies and establishing a small but steady source of income separate from the ranch's main operations. The garden Leanne had planned all winter became reality, plot after plot of carefully tended vegetables and herbs that would provide fresh food through summer and preserve supplies for the following winter. She worked in the garden every day when weather allowed, and Caleb often joined her, learning from her expertise about soil and planting and the patient work of cultivation. On warm evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, talking about the day's work or future plans, or sometimes nothing at all. The copper rings they'd exchanged had tarnished and been polished, tarnished and polished again, becoming familiar weights on their fingers that neither of them noticed until they weren't there. One evening in late May, as they sat watching the last light fade from the sky, Leon said something that had clearly been building for a while. "I'm happy. Genuinely, deeply happy in a way I don't think I've ever been before." She turned to look at him. "I wanted you to know that, in case I don't say it enough. You don't need to say it. I can see it in how you work, how you move through the house, how you talk about future plans like they're certainties rather than possibilities." Caleb reached for her hand and laced their fingers together. "I'm happy too. Happier than I knew it was possible to be. Even though you didn't marry for love, even though this started as a practical solution to a problem, who says we didn't marry for love?" Caleb considered his words carefully. Maybe it wasn't the passionate romance people write about in novels, but what we have feels more solid than that, more lasting. We built this together from respect and partnership and genuine care for each other's well-being. That's a different kind of love, but I think it's the kind that matters more in the long run. Leon smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. "I think you're right, and I think what started as respect has become something deeper without either of us quite noticing when it happened." "You love me," Caleb said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I do, completely and without reservation. Do you love me?" "Yes. I don't know exactly when I started, but somewhere between watching you fix my boot and watching you face down Garrett in the street, I fell in love with you. With your strength and your skill and your refusal to be diminished by people who wanted to make you small." They sat together as the stars came out one by one, brilliant in the thin mountain air, and Caleb thought about how far they'd both come. 6 months ago, he'd been alone in this house, convinced that solitude was what he wanted. Leon had been trapped in a mercantile, treated as property rather than person. Now they were here together, building something that belonged to both of them, something that grew stronger with each passing day. The next morning brought news from town. Wheeler rode up to the ranch with papers and a troubled expression that put Caleb immediately on guard. "What's wrong?" he asked, meeting Wheeler in the yard. "Probably nothing, but Garrett's selling the mercantile. Put it up for sale last week and he's already got a buyer. He's leaving Iron Ridge." Caleb processed this information. "Where's he going?" "Helena, I heard. Or maybe south to Utah. He's being vague about his plans, which usually means he's got debts or legal problems he's trying to outrun." Wheeler handed over a document. "He sent this with me. Said he wanted you to have it before he left." Caleb unfolded the paper and read quickly. It was a brief statement, witnessed and notarized, formally retracting any claims against Leon Joe or Caleb Ward, acknowledging that all debts were settled and all business between them concluded. At the bottom, in Garrett's distinctive handwriting, was a single line: "You won. I hope you're satisfied." "What do you make of this?" Caleb asked. Wheeler shrugged. "Could be genuine. Could be covering his tracks in case you decide to pursue legal action over the rumors and the contract situation. Either way, it's useful to have. Puts the final nail in any future claims he might try to make." After Wheeler left, Caleb showed the document to Leon. She read it twice, her expression unreadable. "Do you think he's really leaving?" she asked. "Wheeler seems to think so. And honestly, it makes sense. He's lost his primary source of free labor, spent $900 buying out a contract he never should have had in the first place, damaged his reputation with his rumor campaign, and been publicly confronted by someone with more resources and influence than him. Staying here just means facing daily reminders of his failures. So we won. We survived. Whether that's the same as winning, I don't know, but it's enough." Leon folded the paper carefully and set it aside. "Then I'm done thinking about Silas Garrett. He's part of my past, and I'm focused on my future. Our future." "Good. So am I." Summer arrived in full force, bringing long days of work and longer evenings of rest. The ranch thrived under their joint management, livestock healthy and productive, buildings maintained and improved, the garden producing vegetables in abundance. Caleb taught Leon about cattle management and timber cutting, and she taught him about preserving food and managing chickens and a dozen other skills she'd accumulated over years of making do with limited resources. They made trips to town together every few weeks, establishing themselves as a couple in the community's consciousness. Some people remained cold or disapproving, but others, Mrs. Chen, Tompkins, Wheeler, and a growing circle of neighbors who cared more about character than heritage, welcomed them warmly. It wasn't perfect acceptance, but it was enough. One afternoon in July, they were working together in the barn when Liane suddenly stopped and put her hand on her stomach with an expression of surprise. "What's wrong?" Caleb asked immediately. "Nothing's wrong. I think I might be pregnant." The world seemed to stop for a moment. "You think?" "I've missed my monthly bleeding twice, and I've been feeling strange in the mornings. Nauseous, but also hungry. And just now, I felt something. Movement, maybe, or maybe just hope imagining things." She looked at him with eyes that held both excitement and fear. "It's too early to be certain, but I think we're going to have a baby." Caleb crossed to her and pulled her into an embrace, careful and gentle. "That's wonderful. Terrifying and overwhelming and wonderful. You're not worried?" "I'm terrified. I don't know the first thing about being a father, but I'm also happy beyond words. This ranch has felt like it was waiting for something, and maybe this is it. A family to fill these rooms, children to grow up in these mountains, a future that extends beyond just the two of us." Liane hugged him tighter. "We'll figure it out together, the way we figured out everything else." "Together," Caleb agreed. By August, Liane's pregnancy was confirmed and visible, her small frame showing the changes more obviously than a larger woman might. They prepared the spare room as a nursery, building a cradle from pine wood and sewing blankets and tiny clothes from fabric they purchased on trips to town. Mrs. Chen became a frequent visitor, bringing advice and supplies, and the wisdom of someone who'd raised 6 children successfully. The town's attitude shifted slightly with the news of Liane's pregnancy. Even those who disapproved of the marriage seemed to soften toward a couple expecting a child. It wasn't complete acceptance, but it was movement in the right direction. On a clear day in early September, Caleb and Liane stood in the meadow behind the house, looking at a spot they'd chosen together. It was level ground with good drainage, protected from the worst winds by a stand of pine, with a view toward the mountains that took the breath away. "Here," Liane said, "this is where we should build." "Build what?" "A proper house, bigger than what we have now, designed for a family instead of a bachelor rancher, with a real kitchen, multiple bedrooms, a room where I can do my sewing and you can do your planning. A house that's ours from the foundation up, not something you inherited from your father." Caleb looked at the spot she'd chosen and saw not what was, but what could be. "It'll take time. Money. We'd have to live in the current house while we built the new one." "We have time. We have some money, and we can earn more. And living in the current house while building the new one is how most people do it." She turned to him. "I'm not saying we have to do this now, or even soon, but someday, I'd like to build something that's entirely ours, a home we create together from the ground up." "Then that's what we'll do. Maybe not this year or next, but someday." Caleb pulled her close, her rounded stomach pressed against him. "We'll build a house here in this meadow, and we'll fill it with children and laughter and all the things this ranch has been missing for too long." "That sounds perfect." They stood together in the meadow as the afternoon sun warmed their faces and the wind carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. Around them, the ranch stretched out in all directions. Land they owned together, land they'd defend together, land they'd pass on to their children and their children's children. 6 months ago, Caleb had ridden into Iron Ridge alone, desperate for a boot repair that could mean the difference between life and death in the brutal winter. He'd found more than a skilled seamstress in that mercantile. He'd found a partner, a wife, a future he hadn't known he wanted until it was standing right in front of him. And Liane, who'd spent 3 years trapped in servitude, had found something she'd stopped believing existed: freedom, respect, love, and a place where she could build a life on her own terms with someone who valued her for exactly who she was. The town of Iron Ridge would talk about them for years to come. The hermit rancher who'd refused every wealthy widow only to marry a Chinese seamstress nobody had noticed. Some would call it scandal. Others would call it foolishness. But Caleb and Liane didn't care about the labels or the gossip or the judgments of people who didn't understand what they'd built together. They had each other. They had the ranch. They had a future taking shape in Liane's growing belly and in the plans they made together on long summer evenings. That was more than enough. As winter approached again and the first snow began to fall, they stood on the porch of their house, their home, and watched the world turn white. Liane's hand rested on her rounded stomach, and Caleb's hand covered hers, both of them feeling the life moving beneath their touch. "Ready for another winter?" Caleb asked. "With you, I'm ready for anything." And in the warm house behind them, the fire crackled and the stove radiated heat, and everything waited in welcome for whatever came next.